Imagine for a moment that you're standing at the edge of a forest. Not a forest you have ever walked through. Not one with marked trails or benches or the distant sound of traffic bleeding through the tree line. This is older than all of that. This is a forest at the end of the last great ice age, somewhere in the broad, wind-scoured middle of Eurasia, perhaps 15,000 years ago, perhaps a little more. The air carries a cold that is not merely uncomfortable but structural, the kind of cold that shapes how every living thing moves, where it shelters, what it hunts, how long it dares to stay still. The sky above the canopy is immense and deeply starred. There is no light pollution for 10,000 miles in any direction. The constellations are the same ones you would recognize today: Orion, the Pleiades, the long river of the Milky Way, but they feel closer here, pressing down through the thin atmosphere with a weight and brilliance that modern eyes have almost entirely forgotten. Somewhere behind you, there is a fire. It is a small fire, the kind that a group of perhaps 15 or 20 people have coaxed into life against the cold, feeding it with care, rotating close to it in shifts through the night. You can smell the smoke, the green wood they have had to use because the dry wood is buried under snow. You can hear the low murmur of voices, the occasional sound of a child, the soft, percussive settling of the embers. And somewhere out beyond the firelight, not close, not threatening, but not entirely absent either, there is something else, a shape, low to the ground, pale grey in the darkness, or perhaps tawny, or black as the space between stars. It has been there, at the edge of the light, for longer than anyone has thought to notice. It is watching, and it is waiting. That shape, that patient, cautious, hungry, and perhaps not entirely fearless shape is the beginning of everything we're going to talk about tonight, because that animal, or one very much like it, will become the dog, not in a moment, not through a single decision made by a single human being on a single night, but through a process so gradual, so woven into the fabric of ordinary life, that by the time anyone would have been able to notice it was happening, it had already been happening for generations. The wolf that stood at the edge of human firelight and chose not to run was already, in some infinitesimally small way, becoming something new. This is the story of that transformation, and it is, when you sit with it long enough, one of the most quietly extraordinary stories in the entire history of life on this planet. We share the Earth with millions of other species. We have coexisted, competed, hunted, been hunted, marvelled at, feared, worshipped, and ignored most of them. But only one of them crossed the boundary between the wild and the human world and stayed there. Only one of them remade itself, over thousands of years, into something that could look us in the eye, read our faces, and feel, in some neurologically genuine sense, what we feel. Only one of them chose us. Or perhaps, and this is one of the great open questions we will spend time with tonight, perhaps we chose each other. Perhaps it was never a single choice at all, but a slow, mutual recognition between two social species who found, against all odds, that they were more alike than either of them had any reason to expect. The science is newer than you might think. The debate is livelier than the textbooks let on, and the story, when you follow it all the way from that unnamed forest to the animal asleep somewhere near you right now, is strange and moving and genuinely unresolved in the most interesting possible ways. Before we begin, and I want to be honest with you, this is a long journey, and I hope you settle in for it. I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you right now? What time is it where you are? There is something I find quietly wonderful about that question. At this very moment, as these words reach you, other people are listening to the same story. Someone in a small room in a rainy city, someone on the other side of an ocean, in a different season, under a different sky. Someone, perhaps, with a dog curled beside them, breathing steadily, utterly unbothered by the 15,000 years of history coiled invisibly inside its sleeping body. Leave a comment. Tell us where you are. Tell us what time it is. Because this story belongs to all of us, and the knowing of where we all are, scattered across the globe in the dark, feels like exactly the right way to begin a story about the oldest friendship the human species has ever kept. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back to the wolf. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to very old wilderness. Not the silence of an empty room, or the silence that falls after a loud sound. This is something older and more complete. The silence of a landscape that has never heard a human voice raised in anything other than necessity, that has never absorbed the vibration of a wheel, or a bell, or a word written down and read aloud. It is the silence of a world that is entirely uncomplicatedly itself. A world operating according to rules that predate language, predate agriculture, predate everything we typically mean when we use the word civilization. Stand inside that silence long enough, and you begin to hear what lives within it. The creak of a pine bough weighted with snow releasing its load in a soft collapse. The distant percussion of ice shifting on a river still weeks away from thaw. The wind moving through a corridor of spruce trees with a low sustained note that is almost musical. Almost, but not quite, because music implies intention, and the wind has none. And then, if you are very still, and the air's moving in the right direction, and fortune is with you, a sound that is not any of those things. A sound that rises from somewhere below the tree line, gathers itself, and then opens upward into the cold sky like a question addressed to no one in particular. A howl. To hear a wolf howl in true wilderness, researchers who have spent careers in the field will tell you, is to feel something shift inside the chest. Not fear exactly, though fear is part of it, a very old part, one that predates rational thought entirely. It is more like recognition. A reminder that the world was not always arranged around human comfort, that for the overwhelming majority of life's history on this planet, creatures like us were not the ones setting the terms. We're going to spend some time in that older world now, because to understand what the dog is and how it came to be, we first have to understand as fully and honestly as we can what the wolf is. And the wolf is not what popular culture has spent centuries telling us it is. Canis lupus, the grey wolf, is one of the most widely distributed large predators in the history of this planet. At the peak of its range, before human expansion systematically dismantled it, the grey wolf inhabited an area stretching from the western coast of Ireland to the eastern shores of Japan, from the Arctic tundra of northern Canada to the subtropical forests of central India. No other land predator of comparable size has ever occupied a range that vast. Not the lion, not the tiger, not the bear. What allowed the wolf to do this was not brute strength, though wolves are certainly powerful animals. A fully grown male grey wolf in peak condition can weigh as much as 100 pounds, can run at speeds approaching 35 miles per hour over short distances, and possesses a bite force measured at around 400 pounds per square inch, enough to shear through the femur of an elk without excessive difficulty. These are not trivial physical capabilities, but what truly made the wolf exceptional, what allowed it to thrive across such an improbable range of climates and terrain types, was something less visible and more interesting than muscle or speed or tooth. It was the pack, wolf-pack structure, as understood by contemporary behavioural ecologists, and here it is worth noting that our understanding of wolf social dynamics was significantly revised in the early 2000s, largely through the field work of researcher L. David Meck, who spent decades observing wild wolf populations in Yellowstone and in the Arctic, and who explicitly repudiated the earlier dominance hierarchy model he himself had helped to popularise. Wolfpack structure, as we now understand it, is not a rigid military hierarchy enforced by constant aggression. It is, in most cases, a family, a breeding pair, their offspring from the current year, sometimes offspring from previous years who have not yet dispersed to find their own territories, occasionally an unrelated wolf who's been accepted into the group after a period of careful social negotiation. The so-called alpha wolves are, in the wild, simply the parents. They lead not because they have fought their way to the top of a dominance hierarchy, but because they are the ones with the most experience, the deepest knowledge of the territory, the longest investment in the survival of the group. Leadership in a wolf pack looks far less like coercion, and far more like what we might recognise, if we are honest with ourselves, as something approaching wisdom. This matters enormously for our story. Because one of the oldest and most persistent myths about the domestication of dogs, a myth we should address directly and set aside carefully before we go any further, is the idea that early humans tamed wolves through dominance, through force, through the assertion of a kind of alpha status that cowed the wolf into submission. This model, still reproduced in certain popular dog training philosophies today, has no meaningful support in either the archaeological record or in what we now understand about wolf behaviour and domestication genetics. It is, to be direct about it, a projection, a story we told ourselves about power and control that turned out to say more about us than about the animals we were describing. The real story is quieter, more mutual, and in many ways considerably more interesting. But we're not quite there yet. Before we can talk about the moment of encounter, the first tentative negotiation between human and wolf, we need to spend a little more time inside the wolf's world. We need to understand not just how wolves are organised socially, but how they experience the world through their senses. Because the wolf's sensory life is so profoundly different from our own that to imagine it is to inhabit something close to an altered state of consciousness. Consider first the nose. A wolf's olfactory system contains approximately 280 million scent receptors. A human nose, by comparison, contains somewhere between 5 and 6 million. The portion of the wolf's brain devoted to analysing olfactory information is, proportionally, roughly 40 times larger than the equivalent region in the human brain. What this means, in practical terms, is that a wolf moving through a landscape is not experiencing that landscape primarily as a visual phenomenon, the way we do. It is reading it, layer by layer, hour by hour, day by day. The passage of a deer across a frozen meadow 3 days ago leaves, for the wolf, something almost like a written record: direction of travel, approximate size, physical condition, reproductive status, level of fear at the moment of passage. A landscape that appears empty to human eyes is, to the wolf, dense with recent and ancient information simultaneously. Then there is hearing. A wolf can hear sounds at frequencies up to 40 kHz, nearly twice the upper limit of human hearing. It can detect the howl of another wolf at distances of up to 10 miles across open terrain. It can isolate a single sound within a complex acoustic environment with a precision that has no human equivalent. The ears themselves are mobile, capable of rotating independently to triangulate the source of a sound, functioning almost like satellite dishes mounted on either side of the head, constantly scanning, constantly adjusting. And the howl itself, that sound that carries across frozen valleys and open tundra and the vast silence of boreal forest, the howl is not simply a noise, it is language. Not language in the human sense with grammar and syntax and accumulated cultural meaning, but communication certainly. Individual wolves have recognizable vocal signatures. A pack's collective howl communicates territorial boundaries. A single long howl in the dark can carry information about location, emotional state, readiness to reunite. Two wolf researchers listening to a recording of a pack howling can disagree productively about its specific meaning, and that productive disagreement is itself a sign of how much is genuinely being communicated. Now place this animal, this extraordinarily sensory, deeply social, cognitively flexible creature, into the same landscape as a group of late Pleistocene human hunter-gatherers. Both species are pursuing the same large herbivores. Both species hunt cooperatively. Both species are warm-blooded, social, long-lived relative to most other animals of comparable size, and dependent on accumulated group knowledge passed across generations. Both species communicate in complex ways. Both species have young that require extended periods of parental care and social learning before they are capable of surviving independently. The overlap is not superficial, it is structural, and here we arrive at one of the genuinely fascinating scholarly debates in this entire field, one that researchers are still actively working through, because the fossil and genetic evidence is suggestive but not yet conclusive on every point. Why the wolf? Of all the social, intelligent, large mammals sharing the Pleistocene landscape with early humans, and there were many, including horses, aurochs, various deer species, wild boar, and several now extinct megafaunal animals, why was it only the wolf that crossed the threshold into domestication? One school of thought, associated with researchers including Pat Shipman of Pennsylvania State University, proposes what has been called the domestication of animals theory, suggesting that early modern humans gained a decisive competitive advantage over Neanderthals, partly through their unique ability to form working relationships with other species, particularly wolves, and that this cognitive capacity for interspecies alliance was, in itself, a defining characteristic of our kind. A competing interpretation favoured by other evolutionary biologists is more modest. The wolf was simply the species that happened to be in the right ecological position at the right time, closely enough associated with human campsites through scavenging behaviour that the initial stages of behavioural change occurred almost accidentally, without intention on either side. Both interpretations are consistent with parts of the evidence. Neither is fully proven, and the tension between them, between a story of human exceptionalism and a story of ecological accident, maps onto something much larger than dog domestication. It maps onto the oldest question we have about ourselves. Are we the species that chose our companions, or are we the species that was chosen? Settle into that question for a moment, because we are going to be living inside it for the rest of this journey. There is a particular kind of darkness inside a cave. Not the darkness of a moonless night, which still carries starlight, still allows the eye to adjust, still permits the slow emergence of shape and shadow from the black. Cave darkness is something else entirely. It is absolute. It is the darkness that existed before fire, before the first torch was carried underground by a human hand, before anyone thought to look at what the walls might contain. It is the darkness in which nothing changes and nothing decays at the same rate as the world above, where bone can survive for 30,000 years in a condition that allows a researcher with the right equipment, the right training, and the right questions to hold it in gloved hands and begin to read it. That is the darkness we are stepping into now. Because the answer to the question of when the first dog appeared, or more precisely, when a wolf population began the slow biological drift away from wolfhood and towards something we might eventually recognize as a dog, is buried in places like this, in caves in Belgium and Germany and the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, in graves along the banks of rivers in the Middle East, in the frozen permafrost of Siberia, which preserves organic material with a fidelity that would seem miraculous if the chemistry were not so straightforwardly understood. The answer is buried in bone. And what bone has been telling us, particularly over the last 15 years as ancient DNA analysis has matured from an experimental technique into a rigorous and reproducible science, is something far more complicated, far more contested, as a set, and far more interesting than the clean origin story that earlier generations of researchers believed they had found. Let us begin with what is not in dispute. Dogs are descended from wolves, not from jackals as some 19th century naturalists proposed, not from a generalized canid ancestor that is neither wolf nor dog, from wolves. Specifically, from a population or populations of the grey wolf, Canis lupus, that underwent a process of domestication at some point during the Pleistocene or the early Holocene, which is to say, at some point between roughly 40,000 and 10,000 years ago. This much is established. The genomic evidence is unambiguous on this point, and has been replicated across multiple independent research programs. Every domestic dog alive today, from the Chihuahua to the Great Dane, from the Basenji of Central Africa to the Australian Shepherd bred on ranches in Montana, shares a common ancestor in the wolf. The genetic distance between dogs and wolves is, by evolutionary standards, remarkably small, smaller, for instance, than the genetic distance between chimpanzees and bonobos, two species that most people readily accept as distinct. What is not established, what is in fact one of the most actively contested questions in the entire field of evolutionary biology and archaeological science, is when this process began and where. And the reason it is contested is not a failure of scientific rigour. It is the opposite. It is because the more carefully researchers have looked, the more complicated the picture has become. To understand why, we need to visit three places. Three sites where bone has been found that forces us to ask the question in a new way each time. The first is a cave called Goya, in the Ardennes region of what is now Belgium. Goya is not a famous cave in the popular sense. It does not have the painted walls of Lascaux or Altamira, but in 2009, a team of researchers led by Mietje Germonpré of the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences published an analysis of canid skull fragments recovered from Goya that produced a result that sent a genuine shockwave through the paleoanthropological community. The skull, based on morphological analysis, which is to say, based on its physical shape, the proportions of its muzzle, the size of its teeth relative to the length of its jaw, the angle of its cranial vault, appeared to belong not to a wolf, but to something that had already begun to diverge from wolfhood, something with a shorter, broader muzzle, something with teeth that were more crowded than a wolf's, because the jaw had shortened before the teeth had reduced in number, something that, if you held it next to a wolf skull from the same period, would look, to a trained eye, measurably different in ways that are consistent with the early stages of domestication. The radiocarbon date on the Goyat specimen was approximately 36,000 years before the present. 36,000 years. That is not 15,000 years ago, which is roughly where the mainstream scientific consensus has tended to locate the beginning of dog domestication when genomic evidence is given priority. That is not even 20,000 years ago. That is 36,000 years ago, or deep in the Upper Paleolithic, at a time when anatomically modern humans had only recently arrived in Europe, when Neanderthals were still present in certain refugia, when the climate was sliding toward the coldest phase of the last glacial maximum. The implications, if the Goyet specimen is genuinely a proto-dog rather than an unusually robust wolf, are staggering. They suggest a process of domestication that began not once but possibly multiple times, in multiple places, across an enormous span of time, and that most of those early domestication events may have ultimately failed, leaving no modern descendants. But here is where scholarly caution must enter the room. Not all researchers accept the germ-on-prey interpretation of the Goya skull, a competing view, articulated by researchers including Darcy Morey and others skeptical of morphology-based identification of early dogs, holds that the physical variation seen in Pleistocene canid remains is insufficient to distinguish confidently between a large, morphologically variable wolf population and a genuine proto-dog. Wolves, particularly during the Pleistocene, exhibited a degree of size and shape variation that modern grey wolves do not, because the megafaunal prey they were tracking was itself larger and more varied. A wolf hunting mammoths and cave bears needed a different build than a wolf hunting caribou and deer. Morphology, in this view, is simply not a reliable enough tool to make the identification the germ-on-prey team claims. This is a genuine, unresolved scientific debate. It is not a debate between careful researchers and careless ones. It is a debate between two groups of careful researchers who are reading the same bones through different methodological frameworks and reaching different conclusions. The honest position, as of the time this script was prepared, is that the Goyet specimen remains ambiguous. It is suggestive, it is important, but it is not proof. Now let us travel east, to a site that is, in certain respects, less ambiguous, though it introduces its own profound complications. In the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, at a site called Razboinichya Cave, another ancient canid skull was recovered and analysed. This specimen, examined by a research team that included Anna Drushkova and Johannes Kraus, yielded a radiocarbon date of approximately 33,000 years before the present. And unlike the Goyet specimen, the Razboinichya skull was subjected not only to morphological analysis, but to ancient DNA sequencing. The DNA results were, in the words of the researchers themselves, closer to modern dogs and prehistoric dogs than to modern wolves or ancient wolves from the same region and period. This is a striking finding. It suggests, though does not conclusively prove, that the Razboinichya animal was on the dog lineage, that it shared a more recent common ancestor with domestic dogs than with the wolf populations living around it at the same time. But the Razboinichya specimen has also attracted significant critical attention. Some researchers have argued that ancient DNA contamination, one of the persistent technical challenges in working with very old genetic material, particularly from bones found in cave environments where multiple animals sheltered across tens of thousands of years, may have confounded the results. Others point out that the sample size is extremely small, and that drawing sweeping conclusions about domestication timelines from a single specimen with a complex taphonomic history is methodologically precarious. Again, genuine uncertainty, held honestly. Let us now move to the site that sits at the other end of the evidential spectrum, the site that offers not ambiguity but something close to heartbreak in its clarity. Bonn-Oberkassel is a small town on the western bank of the Rhine in Germany, just south of Düsseldorf. In 1914, workers quarrying basalt discovered a double burial. A man and a woman, older adults, interred together, dating to approximately 14,200 years before the present. Buried with them, in the same grave, sharing the same layer of red ochre that had been carefully placed over the bodies, were the remains of a dog. Not a wolf, a dog. The morphological evidence at Bonn-Oberkassel has been examined repeatedly over more than a century, most recently and definitively by a team including Luc Janssens and Viviane Thewissen-Lemens, whose 2018 analysis concluded that the animal was unambiguously domestic in its morphology, and more remarkably that its dental remains showed evidence of severe distemper infection during puppyhood, an infection that would have required sustained human care over a period of several weeks to survive. The dog had been nursed through a life-threatening illness. It had been, in some meaningful sense, looked after. The Bon Oberkassel dog is the oldest unambiguous dog burial in the archaeological record. It represents not just a biological threshold, the point at which morphological evidence becomes clear enough that even the most cautious researcher cannot responsibly call the animal a wolf, but an emotional one. 14,200 years ago, somewhere in what is now Western Germany, a human being made the decision to nurse a sick dog back to health. And when that dog eventually died, it was buried with the same care, the same ochre, the same deliberate placement as the two people who had apparently loved it. That fact deserves a moment of silence before we move on. Now, where does all of this leave us on the question of when and where the first dog appeared? The most recent and comprehensive genomic studies, including a landmark 2022 paper published in the journal Nature by a team led by Anders Bergström of the Francis Crick Institute in London, which analysed ancient dog genomes from across Europe and Asia, spanning the last 11,000 years, suggests that by the time the Holocene began, roughly 11,700 years ago, domestic dogs were already present across a remarkably wide geographic range, and already showed distinct regional genetic signatures consistent with having been separated from one another for some time. This finding has led the majority of contemporary researchers to favour a domestication timeline beginning no later than 15,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. The geographic question, where the domestication event or events occurred, remains less resolved. Central Asia and East Asia are both proposed as origin points by different research groups analysing different genomic data sets. The possibility of a Western Eurasian origin has not been fully ruled out. What the Bergström study and others like it have done is to make the single origin hypothesis more plausible than it once seemed, while simultaneously demonstrating that the early history of domestic dogs involved significant population mixing, local extinctions, and replacement events that have obscured the original signal in ways that may never be entirely clarified. The wolf population from which all domestic dogs descend is, itself, extinct. It was not the ancestor of any modern wolf lineage that we can identify with confidence. It was a population that diverged from the main wolf lineage, underwent domestication, and left descendants only in the dogs we live with today, while the wild wolves that shared its landscape went their own way, and eventually, in some cases, went extinct for entirely separate reasons. This is perhaps the most quietly melancholy fact in the entire story. The wolf that became the dog did not survive as a wolf. It gave up its wildness, or had it gradually generation by generation restructured by proximity and selection and the slow gravitational pull of the human world, and in doing so it survived in a form so transformed that its wild relatives would not recognize it. But it survived. In your house, in your neighborhood, in the breathing, sleeping, dreaming animal that has been a companion to our species since before we built cities, before we planted crops, before we invented writing or mathematics or the wheel. The dog is, among other things, a living fossil of a relationship, and we are only beginning to understand how old that relationship truly is. There is a question that sits at the centre of this entire story like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings outward in every direction. Not when, not where, but how. How does a wolf become a dog? Not in the metaphorical sense, not in the loose, impressionistic sense in which we sometimes speak of transformation, the way a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, or the way a river becomes a delta. Processes that feel miraculous until the mechanism is explained and then feel inevitable, in the precise biological generational sense. What actually happened, at the level of behaviour and genetics and neurology and developmental biology, during the thousands of years in which a wild predator slowly became the creature that is today, capable of recognising your face from across a room, of reading the micro-expressions around your eyes with an accuracy that sometimes exceeds that of other humans, of pressing its head against your knee at exactly the moment you most need it to. To answer that question honestly, we need to move through 3 different models that researchers have proposed, 3 different stories about how the first steps of domestication were taken, and we need to sit with each of them long enough to feel both their explanatory power and their limitations, because none of them, taken alone, is sufficient. And the most intellectually honest position available to us right now is that the truth is probably some combination of all 3, weighted differently depending on the time period and the geography in question. But before we enter those models, we need to confront a myth so deeply embedded in popular thinking about dogs and domestication that it has distorted the conversation for generations. The myth goes something like this. At some point in the distant past, a clever and enterprising early human, usually imagined as a man, usually imagined as doing something purposeful and decisive, found a wolf pup, perhaps orphaned, perhaps stolen from its den, and raised it. Through patient handling and selective pressure over many generations, this human and his descendants gradually shaped the wolf into something more manageable, more useful, more obedient. Domestication, in this telling, is a human achievement, a demonstration of our ingenuity and our dominance over the natural world. We made the dog, we designed it, more or less from scratch according to our needs. This is a compelling story. It is also, in all of its essential features, almost certainly wrong. Not wrong in every detail. Humans did at some point begin to actively shape dog populations through selective pressure. There is no question about that. But the idea that domestication began as a deliberate human project, that it was, from the outset, a top-down act of intentional design, does not survive contact with what we now know about the genetics of domestication, the behavioral ecology of wolves, or the cognitive capabilities of Pleistocene hunter-gatherers. Domestication did not begin as a human decision. It began, most researchers now believe, as something far more interesting. It began as a wolf decision. This is the self-domestication hypothesis, and it is currently the most widely discussed model among researchers working at the intersection of evolutionary biology, behavioral ecology, and archaeozoology. Its most prominent contemporary proponents include Brian Hare of Duke University, whose work on canine cognition we will return to in a later chapter, and the evolutionary anthropologist Richard Wrangham, whose broader theory of self-domestication in humans has given the dog version of the hypothesis additional theoretical scaffolding. The core of the argument is this. In the vicinity of late Pleistocene human encampments, there was food. Not food that was given, not food that was offered or shared deliberately, but food in the form of waste, butchered carcasses, discarded bone, scraps and offal that humans left behind at kill sites and campsites. For a large carnivore capable of processing bone and raw tissue, this represented a resource of significant and reliable caloric value. A wolf that could exploit this resource had a meaningful survival advantage over a wolf that could not. But exploiting it required proximity to humans, and proximity to humans was, for most wolves, neurologically impossible. The fear response, the acute, physiologically overwhelming cascade of stress hormones that a wolf experiences in close proximity to a human being, made approach impossible regardless of the incentive. The food was there, visible, smellable, calorically undeniable, and the wolf stood 30 meters away and could not make itself close the distance. Most wolves, not all. Within any population of wolves, there is natural variation in the intensity of the fear response. Some individuals are, by temperament and neurological architecture, less reactive than others, less easily triggered into the fight-or-flight cascade, capable of maintaining something closer to calm in situations that would send their packmates fleeing. This variation is partly heritable. It has a genetic basis, though the genetics of temperament are complex and polygenic, meaning many genes contribute in small ways, rather than a single gene controlling the outcome. The wolves at the lower end of the fear response spectrum, the boldest, the least reactive, the ones most capable of tolerating proximity to something large and strange and smelling of fire and blood, were the ones who could get close enough to the human campsites to access the food. And because they accessed more food, they were better nourished. Because they were better nourished, they were more likely to survive the winter. Because they survived the winter, they were more likely to reproduce. Because they reproduced, their lower fear response genetics were passed to their offspring. Generation by generation, across a span of time that would have been invisible to any individual human lifetime, the population of wolves hanging around human encampments was being selected, by the ordinary logic of differential reproductive success, for reduced fearfulness. No human planned this. No human chose which wolves to breed. No human made any decision at all initially, beyond the decision to leave scraps behind, and even that was not a decision in any meaningful sense, simply the ordinary detritus of human life. The wolves were selecting themselves. And here is where something remarkable happened. Something that, when you understand the mechanism, feels almost like watching a key turn in a lock. When you select for reduced fear response in a social mammal, you do not get only reduced fear. You get a cascade of other changes that arrive, apparently uninvited, as a kind of package deal. Changes in morphology, changes in developmental timing, changes in colouring, in ear shape, in tail carriage, in the timing of reproductive cycles, changes in the social and communicative behaviour of the animal, changes, most importantly for our story, in the way the animal relates to other species, including humans. We know this not from theoretical modelling, but from one of the most remarkable experiments in the history of behavioural genetics. In 1959, at a research facility in Novosibirsk, Siberia, the Soviet geneticist Dmitry Belyaev began a selective breeding program with silver foxes. Belyaev was interested in the genetics of domestication, but he was working in a political environment, the Soviet Union under Khrushchev, in which Mendelian genetics was officially regarded with deep suspicion, the legacy of the disastrous pseudoscience of Lysenkoist biology that had devastated Soviet agricultural research for decades. Belyaev framed his work as a study in animal physiology, which gave it enough political cover to proceed. What he did was simple, in principle, and staggering in its results. From a population of farm-raised silver foxes, he and his team selected, in each generation, only those individuals that showed the least fear and aggression toward humans. Not the most intelligent, not the most physically robust, not the best hunters or the most fertile, only the least fearful. Within 6 generations, a span that, for foxes, represents perhaps a decade, the selected foxes were already showing measurable behavioural changes. They were approaching humans voluntarily. They were making eye contact rather than avoiding it. They were showing something that looked, unmistakably, like affiliative behaviour, the desire to be near, to solicit attention, to interact. Within 20 generations, something that no one had predicted began to happen. The foxes started to change physically. Floppy ears appeared. Piebald colouring, patches of white on what had been uniformly dark coats began to show up. Tails that in wild foxes are carried low and still began to curl upward and wag. Muzzles shortened slightly. The foxes began to vocalise in ways their wild counterparts did not, producing sounds that researchers described as more dog-like than fox-like. A higher-pitched, more varied repertoire of calls that seemed oriented toward communication with the humans around them. None of these physical traits had been selected for. Belyaev and his team had selected for one thing only: reduced fear response. Everything else arrived as a consequence. This suite of correlated changes is now known in the scientific literature as the domestication syndrome, a term popularized and rigorously analyzed by Adam Wilkins, Richard Wrangham, and Tecumseh Fitch in a landmark 2014 paper in the journal Genetics. Their proposed mechanism centers on the neural crest, a population of embryonic stem cells that migrates during fetal development to form an extraordinarily diverse range of tissues, including the adrenal glands, which regulate the stress response, the melanocytes, which determine coat colouring, the cartilage of the ears, and various components of the craniofacial skeleton. The hypothesis, stated plainly, is this: selecting for reduced fearfulness selects for animals with a slightly less active or slightly delayed neural crest cell migration during development. And because neural crest cells contribute to so many different tissue types simultaneously, a subtle change in their behaviour during development produces changes across all of those tissue types at once. Floppy ears, piebald colouring, shortened muzzles, altered tail posture, changed vocalization patterns, and reduced adrenal reactivity all arrive together because they are all, in a developmental sense, downstream of the same upstream change. The domestication syndrome explains why domestic animals across species dogs, cats, horses, cattle, pigs, rabbits, guinea pigs share so many of the same superficial physical characteristics, despite having been domesticated independently from very different wild ancestors. They are not similar because they were designed to be similar. They are similar because the developmental mechanism that produces tameness also produces a predictable cluster of associated physical changes. This is among the most elegant findings in the entire field of evolutionary biology. It transforms what looked like a collection of unrelated observations into a single, coherent, mechanistically grounded explanation. Now, the self-domestication hypothesis is powerful, but it's not the only model on the table, and intellectual honesty requires us to spend time with the alternatives. The second model is what might be called the active adoption hypothesis. In this scenario, Humans, specifically, and this is important, humans encountering very young wolf pups, played a more deliberate early role. A wolf pup removed from its den before the fear, imprinting that occurs around 14 days of age, can be raised by humans in a relatively tractable state. It will not become a dog genetically, it remains a wolf, but it will habituate to human presence in a way that an adult wolf cannot, and it will form social attachments to the humans who raise it. There is ethnographic evidence from contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, including groups in South America and parts of Southeast Asia, of people keeping wolf-like or dog-like animals captured as pups and raised in the community. This practice does not by itself produce domestication. Without selective breeding across many generations, the tamed individual leaves no domesticated descendants. But it could have created the conditions under which early, partially habituated animals were kept near human communities long enough for the first stages of inadvertent selective breeding to begin. The two models, self-domestication and active adoption, are not mutually exclusive. They may have operated simultaneously, or sequentially, or in different proportions in different geographic locations. The archaeological record cannot currently tell us which came first, or whether the question of priority even makes sense given how gradual and multi-local the process likely was. The third model, the commensal scavenger hypothesis, is perhaps the simplest, and in some ways the most parsimonious. It proposes that wolves began associating with human settlements primarily as scavengers, feeding on refuse and waste at the periphery of camps, and that this ecological relationship, wolf as commensal, living alongside humans without being deliberately kept or managed, created the sustained proximity across sufficient generations to allow natural selection to operate on fear-response variation in the wolf population. This model has been articulated most systematically by Raymond and Lorna Coppinger in their influential 2001 book Dogs, A New Understanding of Canine Origin, Behavior and Evolution. The Coppingers argued forcefully that early domestication was driven not by human intention, but by wolf ecology, and that the key selective environment was the human waste heap, the midden, the refuse pit, the place at the edge of camp where the detritus of human life accumulated, and where a sufficiently bold wolf could feed consistently without triggering a human defensive response. What is interesting about the Coppinger model, in the context of everything we now know from the Belyaev-Fox experiment and the neural crest hypothesis, is that it provides an entirely plausible ecological mechanism for producing exactly the kinds of developmental changes that the domestication syndrome predicts. You do not need human intention, you do not need deliberate selection, you need only a human waste heap. A population of wolves with natural variation in fearfulness, and enough generations for differential reproductive success to do its quiet, inexorable work. The wolf approaches, the wolf feeds, the wolf survives, the wolf reproduces. Its offspring are slightly less fearful. They approach a little more readily. They feed a little more consistently. Across 100 generations, which is, for a species with a reproductive cycle of roughly 2 years, only 2 centuries, the population hanging around human camps is measurably different from the population that never approached. And at some point in that process, something else changes too. Something in the neurology of the animal shifts in a direction that is not simply about fearlessness. It shifts towards something that begins to look, from the outside, like interest, like attention, season like a genuine orientation toward the human beings nearby that goes beyond the instrumental calculation of calories available. The oxytocin system, the neurochemical system involved in social bonding in mammals, sometimes called the love hormone in popular science writing, though the reality is considerably more complex than that label implies, begins to respond differently. In wolves, direct eye contact with a human triggers a mild stress response. In dogs, direct eye contact with a familiar human triggers an oxytocin release in both the dog and the human. The same gaze that says threat in the wolf's social language begins to say something else entirely in the proto-dog. It begins to say something that might, very carefully and with all appropriate scientific caution, be described as recognition. 15,000 years of evolution separate that first cautious approach to the firelight from the animal lying beside you now. But the distance, when you understand the mechanism, feels both vast and strangely intimate. Every generation of selection compressed into the next, every small increment of tameness building on the one before, the wolf becoming, Not all at once, but grain by grain, heartbeat by heartbeat, winter by winter, something the world had never seen before, something that needed us, something that, in a way that no other animal has ever quite managed, made us need it back. There is a moment in the life of any relationship when it stops being a negotiation and becomes a fact. When two parties who have been circling each other cautiously, testing the boundaries, measuring the risks, suddenly find themselves on the same side of something, a fire, a hunt, a winter, a danger approaching from the tree line, and realize, without any ceremony or declaration, that the arrangement has become permanent, that neither of them is going back. For dogs and humans, that moment almost certainly did not announce itself. It did not arrive with any fanfare. There was no threshold crossed, no morning on which someone woke up and thought, today is the day the world changes. It arrived the way most of the genuinely important things in human history have arrived, gradually, and then all at once. And then so completely that it became impossible to imagine things having ever been otherwise. By the time the last great glaciers began their long northward retreat, roughly 15,000 years ago, dogs were almost certainly already present in human life in some form. Not everywhere, not uniformly, not in the fully domesticated, genetically distinct form that modern genomic analysis would unambiguously recognize, but present, at the edge of camp, beside the fire, moving through the landscape alongside groups of hunter-gatherers whose own movements were shaped by the movements of the herds they followed and the seasons that governed everything. What we want to understand now is what came next, not the moment of origin, which we have already explored in all its beautiful ambiguity, but the first 10,000 years of the relationship. The period during which dogs and humans learned, in the most practical and consequential sense possible, what they could do for each other. The period during which the dog spread across the planet, embedding itself so deeply into the fabric of human life that by the time the first cities were being built, by the time the first writing systems were being developed, the human world without dogs was already a historical memory that no living person retained. This is the period we are entering now, and it begins, appropriately enough, with movement. Because the dog did not spread across the earth independently. It spread with us. Every major human migration of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene carried dogs along with it, the way a river carries sediment, not as cargo exactly, not as a deliberate transport of valued goods, but as a natural consequence of the relationship itself. Where humans went, dogs followed. And because humans in this period were going almost everywhere, dogs went almost everywhere too. Consider the peopling of the Americas. The question of when humans first arrived in the Western Hemisphere is itself a matter of active scholarly debate. The traditional model placing first entry at approximately 13,000 years ago, via a land bridge across the Bering Strait, has been challenged by mounting evidence for earlier coastal migrations, possibly as far back as 20,000 or more years before the present. But regardless of exactly when the first humans crossed from northeastern Asia into what is now Alaska, the genetic and archaeological evidence is consistent on one important point. They brought dogs with them. Ancient DNA analysis of pre-Columbian dog remains from across North and South America. A body of research advanced significantly by a 2018 study, led by Méranie Lethlobert and published in the journal Science, reveals that the dogs present in the Americas before European contact were genetically distinct from European dogs, sharing ancestry with East Asian dog populations rather than with the dogs that arrived with Spanish and English colonizers in the 15th and 16th centuries. These original American dogs were not domesticated from American wolves. They crossed the land bridge with their human companions, carrying their Asian genetic heritage into a new world. There is something genuinely moving about this finding if you allow yourself to sit with it. Those first humans who walked into the Americas, across a landscape of steppe and tundra and enormous sky, into a continent that no member of their species had ever seen, where every animal was unfamiliar and every terrain feature was new, and the absence of the familiar must have been, at times, overwhelming. Those humans were not alone. They had dogs with them. The same animals that had been sleeping beside their fires, following their hunts, alerting them to dangers in the dark were there, moving through the same unprecedented landscape, equally unfamiliar with it, equally in their way dependent on the relationship for warmth and companionship, and the particular comfort of not being entirely alone in an unknown place. The dog was the one constant that crossed the threshold with us. Now let's go south, further south than the Americas, further south than any land bridge, into the waters between Southeast Asia and Australia, across a crossing that humans made, we believe, somewhere between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago, in what represents one of the most audacious feats of navigation in the entire human story. Those earliest Australians did not bring dogs. Dogs did not yet exist in any form we would recognise. But the continent they settled would, much later, receive a canine visitor that has fascinated researchers ever since. The dingo. The dingo is not a native Australian animal in the deep evolutionary sense. It is not an animal whose lineage stretches back to some primordial Australian canid ancestor. Ancient DNA studies, most comprehensively a 2022 analysis published in the journal Science Advances by a team led by Kylie Cairns, have established that the dingo descends from domestic dog populations brought to Australia from Southeast Asia, almost certainly by Austronesian seafarers, approximately 3,500 to 4,000 years ago. This is one of the most important corrections available to us in this entire story, and it is worth stating with complete clarity. The dingo is not a wild dog. It is not a primitive wolf. It is a feral domestic dog, a domestic dog that was introduced to Australia by humans, that subsequently lived without direct human management for 3,000 to 4,000 years, and that reverted, through natural selection operating on a feral population, to a state of behavioural and partly morphological wildness. It is a window into what domestication looks like running in reverse. A domestic animal gradually shedding the specific adaptations that human selection had built into it, and rebuilding, generation by generation, something closer to the wild template from which its ancestors had come. The dingo is not an ancient wild canid. It is a relatively recent arrival, and it is a dog. But let us return from the southern hemisphere to the broader world of the first 10,000 years, because there is more to this story than migration and geography. There is the question of what dogs actually did during this period, what role they played, what the relationship looked like from the inside, as far as the archaeological record allows us to see. The earliest and most unambiguous evidence of what dogs were used for comes, as so much archaeological evidence does, from graves. Not from middens or campsites or kill sites, where the remains of animals tend to be mixed indiscriminately with those of prey species, and where taphonomic processes make interpretation difficult, from graves, from the deliberate, intentional burial of the dead, which is one of the behaviours that most clearly distinguishes our species from others, and which, when it includes animals buried alongside humans, tells us something important about how those animals were regarded. We have already visited the Bonn Oberkassel burial in Germany, 14,200 years ago, the man and woman interred with a dog that had been nursed through illness. But Bonn Oberkassel is not unique. It is the earliest unambiguous example of a pattern that appears with striking regularity across the archaeological record of the early Holocene. At Ein Malahaya, also known as Einan, in what is now northern Israel, a burial dating to approximately 12,000 years before the present was excavated by Simon Davis and François Valla in 1978. In it, the skeleton of an elderly human, sex and precise age at death debated, was found in a position of deliberate repose, with one hand resting on the skeleton of a puppy. The hand was arranged in a way that strongly suggested intentional placement, rather than coincidental proximity. The puppy was curled in a position consistent with sleep. Someone 12,000 years ago was buried with their hand on their dog. The Ein Malahar burial has been described in the scientific literature as evidence of companionship, of emotional attachment, of a relationship that was not purely functional, not the relationship of a farmer to livestock or a hunter to a working tool, but something more personal, something that the living person who arranged that burial apparently felt was worth preserving, worth marking, worth carrying into whatever came after death. This is a significant claim, and it should be made with appropriate scholarly caution. We cannot read the intentions of the person who arranged that burial. We cannot know with certainty what the relationship between the buried individual and the puppy was, or what the gesture of the hand placement was meant to communicate. Archaeology can show us the arrangement of bones in the earth. It cannot show us grief. But it can show us that a human hand was placed on a puppy 12,000 years ago, with enough care and deliberateness that the position survived intact across 12 millennia of burial. And it can show us that this was not an isolated act. Similar burials have been found at sites across the Levant, across Europe, and eventually across Asia and the Americas, dogs buried with humans, in human graves, treated with a degree of care that in many cases appears comparable to the treatment of the human dead themselves. What did dogs do during these first 10,000 years beyond being loved? They hunted. This is perhaps the most straightforward and most ancient of their working roles. A dog running ahead of a hunter, using its vastly superior olfactory system to locate prey that the human nose would never detect. Driving animals toward positions where the hunter could make a successful throw, this is a partnership that multiplies the effectiveness of both parties enormously. Archaeological evidence from hunter-gatherer sites across multiple continents suggests that the presence of dogs in hunting parties dramatically increased the success rate of human hunters, both by locating prey and by tracking wounded animals that might otherwise be lost. They guarded. A sleeping camp in the late Pleistocene was vulnerable to a range of predators, cave lions, hyenas, bears, wolves, whose approach a human sentry might fail to detect in darkness or during the deep hours of night sleep. A dog with its olfactory and auditory capabilities operating across a radius many times that of human perception was, in practical terms, a perimeter alarm system of extraordinary sensitivity. The tendency of domestic dogs to bark, a behaviour that wolves do not engage in with anywhere near the frequency or volume that domestic dogs do, and which appears to have been amplified by domestication, made them particularly effective in this role. A sleeping camp with dogs was a fundamentally safer place than a sleeping camp without them. They kept humans warm. This may seem trivial, but in the context of a Pleistocene winter without woven textiles, without insulated shelters, without any of the thermal management technologies that later human cultures would develop, the body heat of a dog sleeping against a human body was a measurable and significant contribution to overnight survival. The term three-dog night, referring to a night cold enough to require 3 dogs sleeping against you for warmth, appears in the ethnographic literature of multiple cultures across multiple continents, suggesting that this use of dogs was both widespread and important enough to enter language. They were also, in some times and some places, eaten. This is a fact that tends to produce discomfort in contemporary audiences, and it is worth addressing directly and without embarrassment. The archaeological record across multiple continents and multiple periods shows clear evidence of dogs being consumed as food, cut marks on bone consistent with butchering, dog remains in refuse deposits alongside those of other food animals, and ethnographic accounts from cultures across Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific that describe dog meat as a valued food source in certain contexts, including ceremonial ones. This does not contradict the evidence for emotional attachment. It complicates it in a way that is historically honest. The relationship between humans and dogs in the first 10,000 years was not uniformly the relationship of pet and owner that contemporary Western culture has normalized. It was more variable, more contextual, and more embedded in the practical realities of survival than that model allows. A dog could be a hunting partner, a guardian, a source of warmth, and, in conditions of scarcity or in specific ceremonial contexts, a source of food, sometimes within the same community, sometimes within the same lifetime. What the archaeological record does not show, anywhere, in any period of the first 10,000 years is indifference. Dogs appear in human burials, in human art, in human mythology, in human refuse, in human graves. They are present, consistently and persistently, across every culture and every continent that humans reach during this period. The nature of their presence varies, the emotional register of their presence varies, but the presence itself does not. That is perhaps the most important thing the first 10,000 years tells us. Not that dogs were always loved in the way we love them now, not that the relationship was always benign or equal, or free of the complexities that attend any relationship between two species with overlapping needs and competing interests, but that it was always there. From the moment humans and dogs found each other, across a fire, at the edge of a camp in the cold of a retreating ice age, they did not separate. Through the peopling of an entire planet, through climatic shifts that ended civilizations, through the slow revolution from hunting to farming that remade the human world from the ground up, the dog was present, moving through every landscape we moved through, sleeping beside every fire we built, crossing every threshold we crossed. Already, before history had a name for itself, irreplaceable. There is a particular quality of light in the Valley of the Kings at the hour before dawn. It arrives not as brightness, but as a slow dissolution of darkness, a gradual warming of the eastern horizon above the limestone cliffs, a deepening of the ochre in the rock face, a moment in which the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead feels, if you're standing in the right place with the right kind of attention, genuinely permeable. The ancient Egyptians understood this quality of light. They built their entire cosmology around the drama of the sun's daily death and resurrection, and they populated the threshold between those two states with figures that were neither entirely human nor entirely animal. One of those threshold figures had the head of a dog, Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, of the dead, Heartbea, of the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at, is among the most recognizable deities of the ancient Egyptian pantheon, and he is, in his essential form, a canine. Whether the animal whose head he carries is more accurately described as a jackal or a dog or something in between is a question that Egyptologists and zoologists have debated with genuine interest. The ancient Egyptian word used to describe the animal associated with Anubis, imiut, does not map cleanly onto any single modern species, but the canine identity of the figure is not in question. What is significant for our purposes is what Anubis tells us about how the ancient Egyptians understood dogs. Not as simple tools, not as working animals whose value was purely instrumental, but as beings associated with the threshold between life and death, as with transformation, with judgment, with the protection of the vulnerable passage from one state of existence to another. The dog, in the Egyptian theological imagination, was a guardian of boundaries, the animal that watched over the places where the ordinary rules of the world did not apply. This is a remarkably sophisticated cultural role for an animal that had been domesticated, at that point, for perhaps 10,000 years. And it was not the only role that Egyptian dogs occupied. The ancient Egyptians were, by any reasonable assessment, among the most enthusiastic and systematic dog keepers of the ancient world. Tomb paintings and relief carvings, from as early as the Old Kingdom period, roughly 4,500 years before the present, depict dogs of recognizable types. Lean, or deep-chested coursing dogs with curled tails and upright ears that bear a striking resemblance to the modern Basenji or Pharaoh hound, alongside heavier, more powerfully built animals that suggest the ancestors of Mastiff-type breeds. These dogs are depicted in hunting scenes, running beside their owners in pursuit of gazelle and oryx across the desert margins of the Nile Valley. They are depicted on leashes, wearing collars, some collars inscribed with names, which is among the earliest evidence in the archaeological record of dogs being given individual names by their human companions. Dogs with names including Brave One, Reliable, and Good Herdsman appear in Egyptian records from as early as the Middle Kingdom period, roughly 4,000 years before the present, and dogs in Egypt were mummified. The scale of Egyptian animal mummification is something that continues to astonish researchers even now. Estimates of the number of animal mummies produced during the late period and Ptolemaic periods of Egyptian history, roughly the last 700 years before the Common Era, run into the tens of millions. Cats are the most numerous, but dogs are well represented, particularly at sites associated with the cult of Anubis, where dog and jackal mummies were offered to the god in enormous quantities by pilgrims seeking divine favour. The most significant of these sites is Saqqara, the vast necropolis south of Cairo, where a catacomb system known to Egyptologists as the Anubion contained, when first properly investigated, hundreds of thousands of dog mummies. Some of these animals had been raised specifically for the purpose of ritual offering, a kind of sacred dog breeding industry attached to the temple complex. Others appear to have been pets or working animals whose owners wished them to be presented to the god after death. The distinction between these two categories of mummies, mass-produced ritual offerings and individually placed beloved animals, is itself a window into the complexity of the Egyptian relationship with dogs. It was simultaneously institutional and personal, sacred and practical. The same animal could be a hunting companion, a household guardian, a bearer of sacred meaning, and an object of individual affection, all without any of those roles being felt as contradictory. Now let us travel east and north, into the river valleys of Mesopotamia, where a different but equally sophisticated civilization was developing its own relationship with dogs at roughly the same time. In the cuneiform texts of ancient Sumer and Akkad, dogs appear with a frequency and a specificity that tells us they were a significant presence in the mental and social landscape of Mesopotamian civilization. The Sumerian word for dog, yuur, is among the earliest animal terms attested in written records, appearing in administrative tablets from the late 4th millennium before the Common Era, making it one of the oldest written references to a specific domesticated animal in human history. Mesopotamian dogs served practical roles that are well documented. They were used in hunting, in herding, and as guard animals for homes and temples. Large, powerful dogs, ancestors of what we might broadly call mastiff types, appear in Assyrian palace reliefs from the 1st millennium before the Common Era, depicted in hunting scenes alongside the king, pursuing lions and wild bulls with a ferocity that the relief carvers rendered with genuine anatomical attention. But Mesopotamian dogs also had a sacred dimension that is less widely known. The goddess Gula, or Ninisina as she was known in her older Sumerian form, was the great healer of the Mesopotamian pantheon, the divine physician whose power over disease and recovery was invoked by the sick and the dying across thousands of years of Mesopotamian religious practice. And her sacred animal, the animal that accompanied her in divine imagery and that was kept in her temple precincts, was the dog. The connection between dogs and healing in Mesopotamian culture was not arbitrary. It reflected an observation that ancient peoples across multiple cultures made independently, that dogs lick wounds, and that wounds which are licked appear, in some cases, to heal more effectively than wounds that are not. We now understand the biochemistry behind this observation. Canine saliva contains lysozyme and other antimicrobial compounds that do have modest wound healing properties, but the ancient Mesopotamians did not have access to biochemistry. They had observation, and the observation was enough to associate the dog with the divine power of healing. Dog figurines have been found buried beneath the thresholds of Mesopotamian houses, placed there as protective talismans against illness and evil. Then temple precincts dedicated to Gula have yielded clay dog figurines in extraordinary numbers, painted in colours that appear to correspond to different types of diseases or different categories of divine protection. The dog was not merely a working animal in Mesopotamia. It was a guardian, a healer, a presence at the threshold between the human world and the world of divine power. Let us move now to the western edge of the ancient world, to Greece, where dogs occupied a position in intellectual, mythological and practical life, so various and so richly documented that we could spend an entire chapter on Greece alone, and we must resist that temptation because there is still Rome and China waiting. The Greeks kept dogs for hunting, herding, guarding and companionship. These are the standard categories, and they apply. But what makes Greece particularly significant for our story is the presence of Aristotle. In his Historia Animalium, the history of animals written in the 4th century before the Common Era, Aristotle produced what is, for our purposes, a document of extraordinary historical importance. It is the first systematic attempt in the Western intellectual tradition to classify and describe the different types of dogs, their temperaments, their uses, and their distinguishing physical characteristics. Aristotle distinguishes between dogs used for hunting, dogs used for herding, and dogs used for companionship and guarding the household. He observes differences in body type, noting that hunting dogs tend toward the lean and swift, while guardian dogs tend toward the large and powerful. He comments on the intelligence and trainability of dogs relative to other animals, and on their capacity for what he carefully describes as something like loyalty. He does not use the Greek word for human friendship, philia, but the word he uses carries clear relational weight. This is, in essence, the first breed taxonomy in the historical record, the first attempt to systematize the human observation that different dogs, produced by different selective pressures and used in different ways, are meaningfully different from one another. Aristotle could not have known the genetics behind what he was observing, but what he was observing was real, and his attempt to organize it rationally places him, somewhat unexpectedly, at the beginning of the intellectual tradition that would eventually produce the Kennel Club breed standards of the 19th century. Greek mythology, meanwhile, gave us some of the most enduring canine figures in the Western literary tradition. Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guarded the entrance to the underworld, a figure that, like Anubis, positions the dog at the boundary between life and death, the threshold guardian of the ultimate passage, and Argos, the dog of Odysseus, whose appearance at the climax of the Odyssey has been making readers catch their breath for nearly 3,000 years. Argos, old, flea-ridden, lying on a dung heap, having waited 20 years for his master's return, recognizes Odysseus the moment he appears, despite Odysseus's disguise, despite the years, Despite everything, he wags his tail. He drops his ears. He does not have the strength to approach, and then he dies, having seen what he waited to see. Homer gives Odysseus one line of response before the narrative moves on. The discipline of the disguise demands silence, but the single line is enough. It is one of the most economical emotional moments in all of ancient literature, and it has survived because it describes something that every person who has ever loved a dog recognizes immediately and completely. The capacity of dogs to recognize the people they love, to wait, to know them across time and change and distance. Homer understood this 3,000 years ago, and he put it in a poem. Rome extended and elaborated on the Greek relationship with dogs, adding the characteristic Roman touches of administrative organization and commercial scale. Roman dogs were bred with deliberate attention to type, and Roman writers on agricultural and household management, Marcus Terentius Varro, Lucius Junius Moderatus Columella, devoted sections of their practical manuals to the selection, feeding, training, and medical care of dogs. The Romans distinguished formally between three broad categories of working dog: the dog used for hunting game, the dog used for herding and guarding livestock, and the dog used for guarding the house. Each category had its recognized physical type and its recognized training approach. This three-part taxonomy, so similar to Aristotle's, reflects not a Greek influence alone, but the practical convergence of any sufficiently organized society on the same functional categories. Roman guard dogs were announced in wealthy houses by mosaic warning signs set into the floor of the entrance vestibule. The phrase cave canem, beware of the dog, appears in multiple Pompeian houses, sometimes alongside a mosaic image of a chained dog rendered with enough anatomical specificity to suggest a recognizable type. A powerful dark-coated animal, heavy-headed, low to the ground. The most famous of these mosaics, found in the house of the tragic poet in Pompeii, and now housed in the National Archaeological Museum in Naples, shows a dog on a chain, body tense, teeth visible, caught in a moment of alert aggression that the unknown Roman artist rendered with considerable skill. But not all Roman dogs were there to frighten. Roman lap dogs, small, soft, kept by wealthy women and men for companionship and pleasure, are documented in sufficient numbers to confirm that miniaturization as a deliberate breeding goal was not, as is sometimes assumed, a Victorian invention. The Maltese, a small, white, long-coated companion dog whose ancestry can be traced in ancient Mediterranean art and in the writings of Roman authors, was already a recognizable type in classical antiquity, already kept for the specific purpose of providing company and comfort to its human companions. Now let us travel east along the Silk Road, further than Rome ever reached in political terms, into the vast and ancient civilization of China, where dogs had been present since the Neolithic period, and where the human-dog relationship developed along lines that are simultaneously familiar and strikingly different from anything we have encountered in the Mediterranean world. And Chinese archaeological sites from the Neolithic period, dating to 6,000 or 7,000 years before the present, have yielded dog remains in abundance, and the context of those remains suggest that dogs in early China served the same broad functional categories as dogs elsewhere: hunting, herding, guarding, and, importantly, as a food animal. Dog meat has a long culinary history in parts of China and across East Asia more broadly, and this fact is part of the honest historical record even as it continues to produce strong cultural responses in contemporary Western audiences. But China also gave the world something that no other ancient civilization produced in quite the same form: the deliberate miniaturization of dogs for purely aesthetic and companionship purposes, carried to an extreme that ancient Rome never approached. The ancestors of what we now call the Pekingese, small, flat-faced, heavy-coated dogs, of a type sometimes called lion dogs in historical sources, were kept in the Chinese imperial court from at least the Han dynasty, roughly 2,000 years before the present and possibly earlier. These animals were not working dogs in any conventional sense. They did not hunt. They did not herd. They did not guard in any meaningful way. They were companions, status symbols, objects of aesthetic pleasure, and, within the elaborate symbolic vocabulary of the imperial court, bearers of auspicious meaning, their resemblance to the stylized lions of Chinese Buddhist iconography, giving them a sacred as well as a decorative dimension. The care devoted to these animals was extraordinary by any standard. Imperial Pekingese were, according to historical accounts, fed on shark fin and curlew liver. They were attended by dedicated handlers. They were, in the most extreme accounts, suckled by human wet nurses when their mothers could not provide sufficient milk. They occupied a position in the imperial household that was simultaneously absurd by any practical measure and entirely serious within the value system that created it. What the Chinese imperial lapdog tells us, what Argos tells us, what the Bon Oberkassel burial tells us, what Anubis tells us, is something that runs beneath all of the practical and mythological and administrative roles that dogs have played in human civilization. It tells us that the relationship between humans and dogs has never been, at any point in its history, purely instrumental. There has always been something else present, something that different cultures have expressed differently, through burial, through sacred association, through literary portraiture, through extraordinary material investment, but that appears with remarkable consistency across every civilization that has left us enough evidence to read. Something that looks, across the distance of thousands of years, very much like love. Not identical to what we mean by that word today, inflected differently by different cosmologies and different practical circumstances and different cultural understandings of what animals are and what relationships with them mean. But recognizable. Unmistakably, persistently recognizable. The dog at the foot of the Egyptian queen's chair. The dog buried at the threshold of the Mesopotamian house. The dog of Odysseus, lifting its head one final time on a dung heap in Ithaca. The sleeve dog pressed against the chest of a Tang dynasty empress, breathing slowly in the warm dark of the silk. All of them pointing toward the same irreducible fact, that wherever humans built a world, they built it with dogs inside it, and they have never, in any civilization we know of, chosen to build it otherwise. There is a particular kind of mourning that belongs to medieval Europe. It arrives slowly, through narrow windows that admit more cold than light, through the smell of wood smoke that has settled into every surface of every building over generations of winters, through the sound of bells, church bells, marking the canonical hours, dividing the day into a liturgical rhythm that governed everything from the timing of meals to the scheduling of labour, to the moment at which it was permissible to begin a journey or conclude a contract. It is a morning in which the distance between the sacred and the mundane is not very great, in which the physical world and the spiritual world are understood to interpenetrate each other constantly and visibly, in which a dog lying at the foot of a stone effigy in a parish church is not decoration, but theology. That dog at the foot of the effigy is where we begin, because the medieval period did something to the human relationship with dogs that no previous civilization had quite managed in the same systematic way. It stratified it. It encoded it into law. It made the kind of dog you kept, and the way you kept it, and the rights you had over it, a direct expression of where you stood in the social order, and the social order of medieval Europe was, above all things, a hierarchy. A great chain of being, stretching from God at the apex through angels, through kings, through nobles, through clergy, through merchants, through peasants, down to the animals, and within the animals, further gradations still. Dogs did not escape this ordering. They were sorted into it with the same meticulous attention that medieval society brought to everything it cared about. At the top of the canine hierarchy sat the hunting dog, specifically the dogs of the noble hunt, the pursuit of deer and boar and fox and hare across the vast managed forests that covered enormous portions of medieval Europe, and that were understood, legally and culturally, as the exclusive domain of the aristocracy. In England, after the Norman conquest of 1066, the forest laws imposed by William the Conqueror and elaborated by his successors created a legal framework around hunting that was, by any modern standard, extraordinary in its severity and its specificity. Under these laws, the forests of England and forest here meant not simply wooded land, but any land designated as royal hunting ground, which included substantial areas of open heath and farmland, were protected not merely for the convenience of the king and his nobles, but as a matter of law backed by extreme physical sanction. Poaching was punishable by blinding, castration, and death, and one provision of the forest laws addressed dogs with a directness that tells us everything about how seriously the Norman aristocracy took the question of who had the right to hunt. Any dog belonging to a commoner living within or adjacent to a royal forest was required to be expeditated, a process in which 3 toes were removed from the dog's front foot, rendering it physically incapable of the sustained running speed required to course deer. The expeditation of dogs was not an occasional enforcement measure. It was a routine administrative procedure, periodically verified by forest officials, applied to thousands of animals across the country. A commoner's dog in Norman England was legally maimed to protect the king's deer. This single fact illuminates the entire social architecture of the medieval human-dog relationship more clearly than pages of general description could. The hunting dog, in this world, was not simply an animal. It was a political object. Its capabilities were property rights made flesh, and those property rights belonged exclusively and absolutely to those at the top of the social hierarchy. The great hunting dogs of medieval Europe were kept, bred, and managed with an attention to detail that the modern reader might find surprising. The treatises on hunting that were produced by aristocratic authors across the 14th and 15th centuries, Gaston Phoebus, Count of Foix, whose Livre de Chasse of approximately 1387 is among the most detailed and beautiful documents of medieval hunting culture, Edward of Norwich, whose Master of Game adapted Gaston's work for the English context in the early 15th century. These texts discuss the breeding, feeding, housing, training, veterinary care, and psychological management of hunting dogs with a thoroughness that reflects both genuine expertise and genuine investment. Gaston Phoebus, writing in his chateau in the Pyrenees surrounded by more than 1,600 dogs by his own account, describes the proper management of a hunting kennel with the authority of someone who has spent a lifetime observing dogs with close and affectionate attention. He writes about the importance of choosing breeding stock carefully, me about the signs of illness in young hounds, about the correct way to praise a dog that has performed well and correct a dog that has made an error. Always, he insists, with fairness, with consistency, and without cruelty. A dog that is beaten unjustly, Gaston writes, will not hunt truly. It will hunt in fear rather than in joy, and a dog hunting in fear is no pleasure to watch and no use to the hunt. This is not the writing of a man who regards dogs as interchangeable tools. It is the writing of a man who understands dogs well enough to know that they have interior lives that matter to their performance, and who cares about those interior lives for reasons that go beyond pure utility. Below the great hunting hounds in the social hierarchy sat the working dogs of the agricultural world. Herding dogs, ratting dogs, droving dogs, the animals that kept sheep on the hillside and cattle on the drove roads and rats out of the grain stores. These dogs were not glamorous. They do not appear in hunting treatises or in illuminated manuscripts with any regularity. They appear, if they appear at all, in the margins of agricultural records, in the occasional passing reference in manorial accounts, in the background of paintings where a peasant scene is being depicted, with enough realism to include the dog that was inevitably present. These dogs were working animals in the most direct and economically significant sense. A good herding dog represented a meaningful financial asset to a farming family, an animal capable of managing a flock of sheep across terrain that would require multiple human workers to cover without it. Its loss to illness or injury was a practical economic disaster, not merely a personal one. And yet the documentary record also suggests that these animals were not regarded with the cold instrumentalism that pure economic calculation might predict. Wills from the medieval period occasionally include provisions for the care of dogs. Household accounts sometimes record expenditures on veterinary treatment for working dogs that go beyond what strict economic rationality would justify. Even at the bottom of the social order, the relationship was not purely transactional. Then there is the category that most clearly illustrates how the medieval world managed the tension between the sacred and the sensory, the lapdog. Small companion dogs, the ancestors of breeds like the Maltese, the Italian Greyhound, and various Spaniel types, none were kept by noble and royal women across medieval Europe with a consistency and an intensity of attachment that the Church found periodically troubling. The dog in the lady's chamber, sleeping on her bed, eating from her plate, being carried in her arms through the corridors of the castle, this was a recognisable and widely remarked social phenomenon from at least the 12th century onward. The Church's discomfort with this practice was not primarily about hygiene, though hygiene was sometimes invoked. It was theological. The intense personal attachment that noblewomen formed with their lapdogs was understood by Church reformers as a potential displacement of the love that should properly be directed toward God and toward one's human community. a Saint Bernard of Clairvaux inveighed against the keeping of pet dogs in the 12th century. Later reformers returned to the theme with regularity. The dog in the lady's lap was a small but persistent irritant in the machinery of medieval Christian morality, and yet it persisted. Because the need it met, the need for a particular kind of uncomplicated, physically present, emotionally reliable companionship that the formalities of medieval aristocratic life made difficult to find in human relationships, was real, and the dog met it with a consistency that no amount of theological argument could simply remove. What the Church eventually did, with the pragmatic genius that characterized its management of things it could not eliminate, was incorporate dogs into its own symbolic vocabulary. In Christian art from the Romanesque period onward, dogs appear with increasing frequency as symbols of fidelity, fidelitas, the Latin term that encompasses both loyalty to a lord and faithfulness to a spouse. Dogs appear at the feet of saints, particularly Saint Roch, the patron saint of plague victims, who is almost invariably depicted with a dog licking his wound, an iconographic choice that connects directly to the ancient Mesopotamian association between dogs and healing. Dogs appear at the feet of the deceased in funerary monuments across Europe, positioned beneath the stone effigy of a knight or a noblewoman as a symbol of the loyalty they embodied in life and took with them in death. That dog at the foot of the medieval effigy, which we began with this morning, is therefore not simply decorative. It is doing theological work. It is asserting, in the visual language of Christian iconography, that the person above it was faithful to their Lord, to their spouse, to their God. The dog's loyalty becomes a mirror held up to human virtue. This is a remarkable cultural transformation. An animal that entered human life as a practical partner in hunting and herding has been absorbed so completely into the symbolic vocabulary of a civilization that it now represents one of that civilization's highest moral values. With the Renaissance, something changes in the quality of attention that painters and writers bring to dogs. Not the presence of dogs, they were present in medieval art too, but the quality of observation. Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, painted in 1434 and now hanging in the National Gallery in London, includes in its foreground a small fluffy dog, a Brussels Griffon type, though the exact breed identification is debated, rendered with a specificity of texture and individuality that makes it, despite its small size, one of the most memorable presences in the composition. The dog is not generic. It is a particular dog, with a particular coat, in a particular posture, looking in a particular direction with a particular expression. Van Eyck painted it with the same meticulous attention he brought to the mirror on the wall and the light falling through the window. This is a new development. The dog in the Arnolfini portrait is not a symbol in the way that the dog at the foot of the medieval effigy is a symbol. It is a specific, observed, individuated creature, an animal regarded with enough attention and enough interest that the painter felt its particularity was worth preserving. The Renaissance cultivation of naturalistic observation, the same intellectual current that was producing anatomical drawings and botanical illustrations and the first systematic natural histories, was turning its attention to dogs and finding in them something worth looking at carefully. It found literature too. In the early modern period, the first texts devoted specifically to the keeping and care of dogs as a subject of practical knowledge began to appear in print. Johannes Caius, physician to Queen Elizabeth I and founder of Gonville and Caius College at Cambridge, published his De Canibus Britannicis in 1576, a systematic description of English dog types that represents the first serious attempt in the English language to create a taxonomy of domestic dogs based on observed characteristics and functional categories. Caius distinguishes between dogs used for hunting by scent, dogs used for hunting by sight, dogs used for fowling, dogs used for herding, dogs used for guarding, and dogs kept purely for companionship, which he calls, with a slight but unmistakable edge of condescension, delicate, needy and wanton dogs kept by ladies as instruments of folly. Even in dismissing them, Caius cannot ignore them. The companion dog was too present, too culturally significant to be omitted from a serious account of English dogs, even by a man who disapproved of it. And in the Americas during this same early modern period, the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, a parallel story was playing out with consequences that the European writers never acknowledged and perhaps never fully understood. The dogs that had arrived in the Americas with the first human migrants across the Bering Land Bridge had, over 15,000 years, developed into distinct regional populations adapted to the environments and uses of the cultures that kept them. The Xoloitzcuintli, the hairless dog of Mesoamerica, known to the Aztecs and their predecessors and still kept today as one of the oldest and rarest recognized breeds, was regarded as a sacred animal, a guide for the souls of the dead through the underworld, and was interred in human graves across central Mexico for centuries before European contact. The Salish wool dog of the Pacific Northwest coast, a small, white, long-haired dog kept by the coast, Salish peoples of what is now British Columbia and Washington state, was maintained as a distinct breeding population, kept separate from other dogs, and bred specifically for the production of its long, fine coat, which was harvested annually and woven into blankets of considerable cultural and economic value. The Salish wool dog was not a pet in the contemporary sense. It was a fibre-producing animal, managed with the same selective attention that sheep herders in Europe brought to their flocks. And it was not simply practical. The blankets it produced were ceremonially significant, exchanged at potlatch gatherings as markers of wealth and prestige and social obligation. European contact extinguished the Salish wool dog within a generation or two of sustained interaction. Ysen, European dogs crossbred with Salish wool dogs, European trade blankets replaced the woven dog hair blankets as markers of prestige, and the specific selective pressure that had maintained the breed for centuries dissolved almost immediately. By the early 19th century, the Salish wool dog was functionally extinct, gone so quickly and documented so incompletely that modern researchers have had to piece its history together from the accounts of early European explorers, from indigenous oral tradition, and from a handful of surviving artifacts woven from its fibre. It is one of the earliest recorded cases of a dog breed extinction caused by the disruption of the human culture that had created and maintained it, which tells us something important. Dog breeds do not exist independently of the human cultures that produce them. They are not natural categories that would persist in the absence of the specific social, economic, and ceremonial context that made them necessary. A breed is, in the most fundamental sense, a relationship between a human community's needs and values and the animals that community has shaped to meet them. When the relationship ends, the breed ends with it. The medieval hunting hound could not survive the enclosure of the forest that made the noble hunt possible. The Salish wool dog could not survive the dissolution of the ceremonial economy that made its fibre valuable. The expeditated commoner's dog could not survive the legal revolution that eventually gave commoners the right to hunt. Dogs are shaped by the worlds humans build, and when those worlds change, they change with them. What the medieval and early modern period shows us, across all its variety and all its complexity, is that this shaping was never simply a matter of utility, never purely practical, always entangled with meaning, with the values a society held about loyalty, about hierarchy, about the sacred, about the nature of the relationship between humans and the other creatures that shared their world. The dog at the foot of the effigy, the dog in the lady's arms, the dog on the drove road, the dog woven into the fabric of a ceremonial blanket, all of them saying the same thing in different languages, that wherever humans built a world worth caring about, they made room in it for dogs, and that the room they made told you, more honestly than almost anything else, exactly what kind of world they had built. There is a particular kind of noise that belongs to Victorian London. It is not a single sound, but a layering of sounds, accumulated over decades of industrialization and urban expansion into something so dense and so constant that contemporary visitors to the city remarked on it the way travellers today remark on the noise of a waterfall, not as individual components, but as a continuous environmental presence that pressed against the senses from all directions simultaneously. The clatter of iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestone, the cry of street vendors, the percussion of hammers from construction sites that seemed, in the 1860s and 1870s, to be everywhere at once, as a city of 2 million became a city of 4 million, and then 5 million, within the span of a single human lifetime. The hiss of steam from railway engines arriving and departing through the new termini that had been driven into the heart of the old city like nails. Beneath all of it, persistent and inescapable, the sound of animals, horses most numerously, but also cattle being driven to market, and threading through all of it, the barking of dogs. There were an enormous number of dogs in Victorian London. Estimates vary. and the methodology behind 19th century urban animal censuses was not rigorous by modern standards, but figures from the 1870s suggest a dog population in Greater London of somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 animals, a number that, given the density of human habitation and the narrowness of the streets through which they moved, would have made dogs a constant and unavoidable feature of daily urban life in a way that is difficult to fully imagine from the vantage point of a contemporary city. These dogs were not all of the same kind. They were not all of the same status. They were not all regarded with the same mixture of affection, utility, and anxiety that the Victorian middle class was in the process of developing toward animals in general, and dogs in particular. There were working dogs, the terriers ratting in the warehouses along the Thames, the droving dogs managing the last legs of cattle drives into the city's abattoirs, the dogs pulling small carts through streets too narrow for horses. There were stray dogs, living in the interstices of the city's infrastructure, neither wild nor owned, navigating the complicated social ecology of an urban environment that had not been designed with them in mind. And there were, increasingly, the other kind, the kind that lived inside, the kind that slept on furniture, the kind whose portraits were commissioned from professional animal painters, the kind that were, without anyone having quite decided this was going to happen, becoming members of the family. This transformation, the elevation of the dog from working partner and household utility to domestic companion with emotional significance and social status, is one of the defining cultural shifts of the Victorian period, and it did not happen in isolation. It happened as part of a broader reconfiguration of middle-class domestic life that touched almost everything: the architecture of the home, the role of women within it, the understanding of childhood, the development of leisure as a distinct category of human activity, and the emergence of sentiment, the cultivated capacity for emotional response, as a value in itself rather than a weakness to be suppressed. Into this reconfiguring world came, in 1873, the Kennel Club. Founded in London in that year, the Kennel Club was the first organisation in the world dedicated to the systematic registration, standardisation, and governance of pedigree dogs as a formal category of animal. Its founding is not, in retrospect, a surprising event. It was the inevitable institutional expression of a cultural tendency that had been building for decades, the tendency to apply to dogs the same organising principles of classification, standardisation, and record-keeping that the Victorian mind was applying to everything else it touched, from the geological strata of the English countryside to the species of the Galapagos Islands to the administrative territories of the British Empire. The Kennel Club did something that had never been done before in quite this way. It defined what a breed was, not in the loose vernacular sense in which the word had always been used, the sense in which a shepherd might say that his dog was of the old working collie breed, meaning a type with certain functional characteristics that had been maintained by consistent use over many generations, in a formal, codified, legally consequential sense. A breed, in the Kennel Club's definition, was a population of dogs whose physical characteristics conform to a written standard, a document specifying, with considerable precision, the ideal dimensions, proportions, coat type, colour, ear shape, tail carriage, and overall appearance of the animal. Dogs that conformed to the standard were registrable. Dogs that did not were not. This was a revolution, and like most revolutions, it is only partially understood if you look only at what it created rather than also at what it destroyed. What it created was the modern dog breed as a cultural institution, a named, standardised, registrable population of animals whose membership was determined not by function, not by what the dog could do, but by what the dog looked like. The show dog, as a category of animal, was born in this moment, an animal whose entire reason for existence was the embodiment, in living flesh, of a written ideal. The first formal dog show had actually preceded the Kennel Club's founding by more than a decade. In 1859, at a public house in Newcastle upon Tyne called the Town Hall, a show was held for pointers and setters only, attracting 60 entries and an audience of enthusiastic local sportsmen. It was a modest, informal event by any standard, but it established a template that spread with remarkable speed across Britain. By 1863, a show at Crystal Palace in London was attracting more than 1,000 dogs and tens of thousands of visitors, and then across the Atlantic, where the Westminster Kennel Club held its first show in New York City in 1877, 6 years before the American Kennel Club was formally constituted in 1884. The dog show was, among other things, a spectacle. A form of middle-class entertainment that combined the excitement of competition with the pleasure of looking at animals, the social ritual of public gathering, and the ideological satisfaction of witnessing the principles of systematic improvement applied to living nature. It was, in its own way, a thoroughly Victorian form of pleasure. But here is the myth we need to address directly, because it is among the most widespread misconceptions about the history of dog breeds, and it has consequences that extend well beyond historical accuracy into the contemporary question of dog welfare. The myth is this: that the breeds we recognize today are ancient, that the Labrador Retriever descends from dogs that have looked more or less like Labrador Retrievers for centuries, that the Bulldog is an ancient British type whose history stretches back to the medieval period in something close to its current form, that the breeds we see in show rings today represent the culmination of a long, gradual, natural process of refinement that merely received its final organisational expression in the Victorian era. This is not accurate. The overwhelming majority of the breeds recognised by the Kennel Club and the American Kennel Club today were fixed, given their current standardised appearance, within a period of approximately 50 years, between roughly 1860 and 1910. Some were created from scratch during this period, deliberately crossed from existing types, to produce a new combination of characteristics that someone found aesthetically appealing. Others were taken from existing working populations and standardized, their appearance frozen and codified at a particular moment, their subsequent development governed by the breed standard rather than by the functional pressures that had shaped them previously. The Bulldog is perhaps the most dramatic example of what this standardization process could produce in terms of physical transformation. The Bulldog of the early 19th century, the animal that was used in bull baiting, the practice of setting dogs against tethered bulls that was banned in Britain in 1835, was a physically capable, moderately built animal with a shortened muzzle, but with sufficient respiratory function to sustain the violent physical exertion that bull baiting required. By the end of the Victorian period, the show bulldog had been transformed through selective breeding for an exaggerated version of the breed's characteristic features into an animal with a muzzle so shortened, a skull so broadened, and a chest so massive relative to its hindquarters that natural reproduction had become difficult and natural whelping had become, in many breeding lines, nearly impossible. This is not a comfortable fact, but it is a necessary one. The acceleration of selective breeding that the Kennel Club system produced, the narrowing of breeding populations to animals that conform to written standards, the prioritization of appearance over function, the prestige attached to winning at shows, had consequences for the health of dogs that no one in 1873 anticipated, and that the dog fancy, as the community of pedigree dog enthusiasts came to be known, was extremely slow to acknowledge. When you narrow a breeding population dramatically, selecting only from the animals that win at shows, or that are born to champion parents, or that display the most extreme version of whatever characteristic the standard prize is, you simultaneously narrow the genetic diversity of that population. Every animal that is not bred from removes genetic material from the pool. Every generation of selection for a particular appearance is a generation of selection against the full range of genetic variation that would otherwise be available. The result, across many breeds, was the accumulation of genetic disorders that are now so deeply embedded in certain breed populations that eliminating them while maintaining the breed's recognized characteristics is, in some cases, functionally impossible without a degree of outcrossing that the breed standards do not permit. This is the shadow side of the Victorian Revolution, not the result of malice, and not a reason to regard everyone involved in Victorian dog breeding with retrospective contempt. They were doing what their intellectual framework told them was improvement. An improvement, in the Victorian mind, was always a virtue. But it is a consequence that honest history must acknowledge. The Kennel Club system did something else that is worth examining carefully, because its effects are still very much with us. It changed the relationship between dogs and social class in a way that was new, even by the standards of a history in which that relationship had always been stratified. In the medieval period, the kind of dog you kept reflected your position in an existing social hierarchy. The hierarchy was given, and the dog was one of many markers of where you stood within it. In the Victorian period, the kind of dog you kept could actively construct your social position. Owning and showing pedigree dogs was an activity through which the newly prosperous middle class could perform its aspirations, could demonstrate taste, leisure, organisational participation, and the capacity for the kind of systematic, principled engagement with improvement that the Victorian value system most admired. The dog show was, in this sense, a social technology, a mechanism through which class identity could be performed and reinforced through the medium of animals. Queen Victoria's personal enthusiasm for dogs, she kept a large and varied collection throughout her reign, with particular affection for Pomeranians, Collies and Dachshunds, and was known to insist that her dogs accompany her on public occasions, gave royal sanction to the broader cultural trend, and accelerated its spread through the social strata below the aristocracy. If the Queen kept pedigree dogs with visible affection, and allowed them to appear in her official portraits, then keeping pedigree dogs was not merely acceptable for the aspiring middle class. It was positively desirable. And then, in 1885, something happened that changed the practical circumstances of urban dog keeping in ways that the founding of the Kennel Club had not. Louis Pasteur administered the first successful rabies vaccination to a human being. The patient was Joseph Meister, a 9-year-old Alsatian boy who had been severely bitten by a rabid dog and who, without intervention, faced almost certain death from a disease that was, before Pasteur's work, universally fatal once clinical symptoms appeared. Pasteur's treatment, a series of injections of attenuated rabies virus, administered over 13 days, prevented the disease from developing. Meister survived. The rabies vaccine did not immediately eliminate rabies from the urban dog population. That process took decades of public health effort, mandatory vaccination programs, and the development of effective canine vaccines that could be administered practically at scale. But Pasteur's demonstration that the disease could be prevented transformed the cultural and political relationship between city governments and urban dogs almost immediately. Before the vaccine, the periodic outbreaks of rabies in European and American cities had generated genuine public terror, a fear not merely of the disease itself, which was horrible enough in its clinical presentation, but of dogs in general, whose bite suddenly carried the possibility of a death that was both agonizing and inevitable. The panic responses to rabies outbreaks, mass cullings of street dogs, restrictions on the movement of owned dogs, campaigns of public anxiety that made dog keeping in dense urban environments genuinely controversial, had created a real tension between the growing cultural enthusiasm for dogs as companions and the legitimate public health concerns associated with keeping large numbers of unvaccinated animals in close proximity to human populations. The vaccine began, slowly, to resolve that tension in favour of the dogs. By the turn of the 20th century, the convergence of several forces, the Kennel Club system providing organisational infrastructure and social cachet, the rabies vaccine reducing the public health case against urban dog keeping, the broader cultural shift towards sentiment and domesticity that the Victorian period had produced, and the expanding prosperity of the middle class that gave more families the material resources to keep animals that did not strictly need to earn their keep. Hunter had produced something that would have been unrecognisable to a medieval peasant, and perhaps even to an 18th century aristocrat. The pet dog. Not the working dog, not the hunting dog, not the herding dog, or the ratting dog, or the guard dog. The dog kept primarily, and in many cases exclusively, for the pleasure of its company. The dog that lived inside, ate food purchased specifically for it, received veterinary care that represented a meaningful household expenditure, and occupied a position in the emotional life of a family that was beginning, hesitantly and then with increasing confidence, to be described in terms that had previously been reserved for human relationships, the dog as family member. This was the Victorian Revolution's deepest and most lasting achievement. Not the breed standards, not the show ring, not the stud books and registration systems that the Kennel Club put in place. Those were the mechanisms. The achievement was the idea that a dog was not a tool, not a symbol, not a working partner, not a commodity, though it could be all of those things, and the Victorian period was thoroughly unsentimental about the commercial dimensions of dog breeding, but a being with its own emotional interiority that mattered, that deserved consideration, that could be loved and could love in return in ways that were worth taking seriously. This idea was not entirely new. We have seen it in the Bon Oberkassel burial. We have seen it in Homer's Argos. We have seen it in the hand of the buried elder resting on the puppy at Einmalaha. The capacity for this kind of attachment to dogs is not a Victorian invention. It is as old as the relationship itself. What the Victorians did was make it respectable, make it a value rather than a weakness, make it something that could be displayed publicly, written about, painted, legislated for, organised around. They did not invent the love of dogs. They simply decided, for the first time in the history of Western civilization, that it was something to be proud of. And that decision, that particular piece of cultural permission, is the air that every contemporary dog owner breathes without noticing it. The Victorian Revolution is, in this deepest sense, still ongoing. We are all, in the way we think about our dogs, and feel about our dogs, and organise our lives around our dogs, living inside it still. There is a particular kind of silence that follows an artillery barrage. It is not the silence of peace, or the silence of an empty landscape, or the silence we have encountered before in this story. The deep, structural silence of old wilderness untouched by human sound. It is the silence of aftermath. The silence that presses in from all sides after the last shell has fallen and the last echo has rolled away across the churned mud and the splintered wood and the wire, and the world seems for a moment to be holding its breath before deciding what comes next. Into that silence, across the battlefields of the First World War, a dog would sometimes come, not charging, not barking. Moving low and fast through the cratered ground, nose working constantly, reading the landscape with the olfactory precision that 15,000 years of co-evolution with humans had built into the architecture of its skull. It was looking for something specific, not prey, not food, not the scent trail of a familiar person. It was looking for the living among the fallen, the soldier still breathing in the shell crater, the man too wounded to call out, the body that still had a pulse and needed with urgency to be found. These were the Red Cross dogs of the Western Front, trained by organisations in Germany, France, Britain and Belgium to locate casualties on the battlefield and to remain with them, alerting their handlers to the position, carrying small medical supplies in the packs strapped to their backs, bandages, water, sometimes a flask of brandy, until human stretcher-bearers could reach the wounded man. They were not perfect. They could not distinguish in all cases between the living and the recently dead. They were sometimes killed by the same artillery that had produced the casualties they were searching for. The conditions under which they worked, gas, noise, fire, the overwhelming olfactory chaos of a First World War battlefield, were among the most extreme that any working animal has ever been asked to operate in. But they found people, repeatedly, reliably, under conditions in which human searchers alone would have missed them. The German military, which had the most systematic pre-war dog training program of any of the major belligerents, deployed an estimated 30,000 dogs during the First World War, in roles that included messenger carrying, sentry duty, wire laying and casualty detection. French and British military dog programs, slower to develop because pre-war institutional resistance to animal-assisted military operations was stronger in those armies, eventually fielded thousands of animals in similar roles. The dog that most people in the English-speaking world associate with First World War military service is not, however, a European dog. It is an American one. Sergeant Stubby was a Boston Terrier mix, or something close to one, though his precise ancestry was never formally established, who was smuggled onto a troopship by a soldier of the 102nd Infantry, 26th Division of the United States Army in 1917, brought to France, and proceeded to serve with that unit through 17 engagements, over approximately 18 months on the Western Front. Stubby learned to locate wounded soldiers by sound and smell. He warned his unit of incoming gas attacks before the human soldiers had detected the agent. He reportedly located and held a German spy who had been mapping Allied trenches, biting the man's leg and refusing to release him until American soldiers arrived. He was officially promoted to the rank of sergeant by General John Pershing. He met 3 American presidents. He is the most decorated war dog in American military history, and his mounted remains are currently held in the collections of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, District of Columbia. Stubby's story is remarkable, and it is also, in the context of this larger history, entirely consistent with a pattern that runs through the entire modern period of military dog use. The gap between institutional recognition of what dogs can do and institutional willingness to prepare for it in advance. Armies consistently discovered, in the midst of the conflicts they had not adequately prepared for, that dogs could perform functions that humans alone could not, and then, when the conflict ended, systematically dismantled the programs they had built, only to rediscover the same capabilities in the next conflict. This pattern repeated itself precisely and almost without variation in the Second World War. American, British, German, and Soviet forces all deployed dogs in significant numbers during the Second World War. Soviet anti-tank dogs, animals trained to carry explosive charges and run beneath enemy tanks, triggering the detonation by means of a pressure lever, represent perhaps the most morally troubling chapter in the history of military animal use, a program that combined genuine tactical logic with a cost in animal life that is difficult to contemplate without discomfort. German Shepherd dogs served as sentries, trackers, and search and rescue animals with Allied and Axis forces alike. The British used dogs in North Africa and in the Burmese campaign with results that were sufficiently impressive to produce, after the war, a more sustained institutional commitment to military working dog programs than Britain had maintained previously. And then, in 1957, the relationship between dogs and human ambition reached a threshold that had no precedent in any of the history we have covered. Laika, a stray dog found on the streets of Moscow, a small mixed-breed female of approximately 6 kilograms, selected for her calm temperament and her apparent ability to tolerate confinement, was placed aboard Sputnik 2 on the 3rd of November, 1957, and launched into Earth orbit. She was the first living creature from Earth to orbit the planet. She was also, as Soviet officials acknowledged only decades later, sent to orbit with no provision for her return. The technology to bring her back did not exist. The mission was designed to gather physiological data on a living organism during launch and in the early stages of spaceflight. She survived the launch. She survived the achievement of orbit. She died within hours from overheating caused by a thermal control failure. Alone in a capsule travelling at approximately 28,000 kilometers per hour around a planet she had spent her brief life walking across. The ethical dimensions of Laika's mission have been debated continuously since the details became fully known to the international scientific community in the early 2000s, following the declassification of Soviet space program records. The Soviet space scientists who worked directly with Laika, Oleg Gazenko, one of the lead researchers on the biological aspects of the Sputnik 2 mission, spoke publicly about her fate late in his life, expressed genuine regret about what had been done, framing it as a decision made under enormous political and technical pressure in the context of the space race, and acknowledging that the data obtained did not justify the cost. We do not linger on this story to produce distress, but because Laika's mission illuminates something important about the human-dog relationship that the more comfortable parts of this history can obscure. The relationship has not always been one of equal consideration. Dogs have been used, genuinely used, instrumentally, without regard for their experience, in contexts where the human purpose was judged to outweigh the animal cost. Laika is the most extreme modern example of this, but she is not without precedent in a history that includes expeditated dogs and anti-tank dogs, and the tens of thousands of animals killed in the training programs and operational deployments of 2 world wars. The honest history of dogs at work must hold both things simultaneously: the genuine partnership and the genuine exploitation, the love and the use. They are not opposites, they are uncomfortably the same relationship viewed from different angles. But let us turn now to the parts of the modern working dog story that are less ambiguous in their moral character, because the 20th century also produced something genuinely new in the history of dogs serving human needs. It produced the guide dog. The systematic training of dogs to guide blind people had antecedents in various informal practices, but its modern institutional form began in Germany in the aftermath of the First World War, where the large number of veterans blinded in the conflict created both a clear need and a pool of trained military dog handlers who understood what dogs could be taught to do. The program developed by the German Shepherd organization in Oldenburg became the template for guide dog training worldwide. In the United States, the Seeing Eye organization was founded in 1929 by Dorothy Harrison Eustace and Morris Frank, following Eustace's observation of German guide dog programs and Frank's urgent desire to obtain a guide dog that would restore his independence. The partnership between Buddy, a German Shepherd female who became Frank's guide dog, and Frank himself became the founding story of the American guide dog movement, and the principles of guide dog training developed in that early period remain, in their essentials, the basis of guide dog programs worldwide today. What the guide dog represented, as a concept and as a practical reality, was something qualitatively different from the military or hunting or herding roles that had defined working dogs throughout most of the relationship's history. The guide dog was not enhancing a human capability. It was substituting for a lost one. It was, in the most direct and concrete sense, serving as a prosthetic, a living extension of the human nervous system, processing spatial and obstacle information and translating it into physical guidance. The neurological and behavioural requirements for this role are extraordinary. A guide dog must be able to navigate complex urban environments, traffic, crowds, construction sites, irregular surfaces, unpredictable obstacles, while maintaining constant awareness of the human on the other end of the harness. It must be capable of what is called intelligent disobedience, the ability to refuse a handler's command when following that command would place the handler in danger. If a blind person commands their guide dog to move forward at a traffic crossing, and the dog perceives a vehicle approaching that the person has not heard, the dog must override the command and hold position. This requires a level of independent judgment, of situational assessment and decision-making in real time, that sits very close to the boundary of what we typically mean when we talk about animal cognition. The detection dog programs that developed across the second half of the 20th century extended the working dog's perceptual capabilities into domains that continue even now, to surprise researchers with their precision and their reliability. Narcotics detection dogs, explosive detection dogs, currency detection dogs, these applications were all based on the same fundamental principle, that the dog's olfactory system, with its 280 million scent receptors and its proportionally enormous neural processing capacity, could be trained to alert to specific chemical signatures with an accuracy that no human technology available at the time of the program's development could match. What was genuinely unexpected was the discovery, beginning in the 1980s and accelerating dramatically in the 2000s and 2010s, that dogs could be trained to detect not just specific chemical compounds, but the complex metabolic signatures associated with specific human disease states. The earliest systematic research into cancer detection by dogs, published in the British Medical Journal in 2004 by a team led by Carolyn Willis, demonstrated that dogs trained on urine samples could identify bladder cancer with an accuracy significantly above chance. Subsequent studies, conducted across multiple countries and multiple cancer types, have produced consistent evidence that dogs can detect lung cancer, breast cancer, colorectal cancer, and prostate cancer from breath or urine samples with sensitivity and specificity rates that, in some studies, compare favourably with established medical diagnostic tests. The biochemical basis of this capability is understood in general terms. Cancerous cells produce volatile organic compounds as metabolic byproducts that differ from those produced by healthy cells, and these compounds are present in breath and urine in concentrations that the human nose cannot detect but the dog nose can. But the specific compounds that dogs are identifying and the precise olfactory mechanism by which they distinguish cancerous from non-cancerous samples is still an active area of research. Most recently, and with considerable scientific interest, studies conducted at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and published in 2020 demonstrated that dogs could be trained to detect coronavirus infection from skin odour samples with a sensitivity of approximately 94% and a specificity of approximately 92%, figures that, if validated at scale, would represent a potentially significant public health screening tool. The dog's nose, it appears, is not merely a remarkable natural instrument. It may be a medical diagnostic tool of genuine clinical value, easy operating on principles that human technology has not yet fully replicated. And then there is the role that has perhaps most transformed the daily lives of people who need it, even though it receives less institutional recognition than military or detection work. The therapy dog, the emotional support animal, the psychiatric service dog. The systematic use of dogs in therapeutic contexts has a research history that begins, formally, with the work of the child psychologist Boris Levinson, whose 1965 book Pet-Oriented Child Psychotherapy described his clinical observations that the presence of his dog jingles in therapy sessions with withdrawn and uncommunicative child patients produced measurable improvements in those patients' willingness to engage. Levinson's initial presentation of these findings to his professional colleagues was met with considerable skepticism and, by some accounts, with laughter. The idea that a dog in a therapy room was a legitimate clinical tool rather than an eccentric personal habit was not, in 1965, easy to take seriously in mainstream psychiatric practice. The decades since have produced a substantial and growing body of research that has substantially validated Levenson's clinical intuitions. Cortisol levels, the primary biomarker of physiological stress, decrease measurably in humans who interact with dogs. Blood pressure drops, heart rate slows. Oxytocin levels rise in both the human and the dog during positive interaction. The presence of a dog in a clinical or educational or workplace environment produces, consistently and across multiple study designs, measurable reductions in reported anxiety and measurable improvements in social engagement and mood. The mechanism is, at least in part, the same oxytocin feedback loop that we identified when we discussed the neurological changes of domestication. The gaze exchange between a human and a familiar dog, the direct eye contact that triggers oxytocin release in both parties, is not merely a behavioral observation. It is a measurable physiological event with real consequences for the hormonal and neurological state of both participants. The dog, in other words, is not simply perceived as comforting. It is physiologically comforting. Through a mechanism that evolution built into the relationship over thousands of years of coexistence, and that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to map with the precision it deserves. From the battlefields of the Somme to the therapy rooms of children's hospitals, from the streets of Moscow to the surface of space, from the explosion detection lanes of airport security to the clinical trials of cancer diagnostics, from the harness of a guide dog navigating a city intersection to the warm weight of a therapy dog pressed against the leg of a child who has not spoken in 3 weeks, and is, for reasons no one yet fully understands, beginning to speak now. This is what dogs have done in the modern world, not because anyone planned the full extent of it, not because anyone, in the early years of the domestication relationship, could have imagined that the wolf at the edge of the firelight would one day be boarding spacecraft and detecting cancer, and teaching traumatized children to trust the world again. But because the relationship, over 15,000 years, built into both parties something that keeps finding new expressions, a capacity for mutual attentiveness, a willingness to be present, consistently and without judgment, in exactly the moment that presence is needed most. The wolf became a dog, and the dog became, in ways that are still unfolding, something that no other relationship in human history has quite produced. An animal that works alongside us not because it has no choice, but because, and the research increasingly supports this, it genuinely wants to. There is a particular quality of attention that a dog gives you when you're not looking at it. Not the performance of attention, not the ears forward, the tail raised, the body oriented toward you, in the posture of readiness that a dog adopts when it expects something to happen. Something quieter than that. Something that you catch only in peripheral vision, or in the moment you turn unexpectedly and find the dog already watching, already tracking the small meteorology of your mood, with an instrument so finely calibrated that it registers changes you have not yet registered in yourself. The dog knows, before you do, that something is wrong, or that something is about to change, or that you are, in some way that has not yet surfaced into your own consciousness, sad. Every person who has lived closely with a dog has experienced this. It is so common, so unremarkable in its recurrence, that most dog owners simply absorb it into the background of daily life, without pausing to consider how extraordinary it actually is. An animal of a different species, with a different nervous system and a different perceptual world, is monitoring your internal state with sufficient precision to detect fluctuations that your own introspective capacity has missed. The question of how this is possible, of what is actually happening, neurologically and cognitively and evolutionarily, when a dog watches you with that quality of attention, is what the science of the past 20 years has been trying, with increasing sophistication and increasing success, to answer, and the answers, when you sit with them long enough, are among the most interesting things that modern science has produced about any non-human animal. Let us begin with the brain. In 2011, a neuroscientist at Emory University in Atlanta named Gregory Burns began a project that most of his colleagues initially regarded as eccentric, if not actually misguided. Burns wanted to put dogs in a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, the same technology used to image human brain activity, by detecting changes in blood oxygenation levels in different neural regions, and use it to examine what was actually happening inside the canine brain during various kinds of experiences and stimuli. The technical challenges were considerable. Functional magnetic resonance imaging requires the subject to remain completely still, inside a loud, confined machine for extended periods. Human subjects are typically told to lie still and are given the option of sedation. Burns wanted to scan dogs while they were awake and conscious, because sedation would eliminate the very neural activity he was trying to measure, which meant training dogs to voluntarily enter and remain still inside an MRI scanner without restraint, using only positive reinforcement. He and his team spent months training their first two subjects, his own dog, a mixed terrier named Newton, and a dog belonging to one of his graduate students, to climb onto the scanner platform, assume the required posture, and remain motionless through the noise and confinement of the scanning process. By the standards of animal behavioral research, what they achieved was genuinely remarkable. A dog voluntarily cooperating with a research procedure that would test the tolerance of many human subjects, motivated by nothing more than positive reinforcement and, apparently, a genuine willingness to engage with the researchers asking it. The initial results, published in the journal PLOS One in 2012, showed that the caudate nucleus, a brain region associated in humans with positive expectations, with anticipatory reward processing, with the neural signature of wanting something good to happen, was activated in dogs by the hand signal that the researchers had trained as a predictor of a food reward. This was not in itself surprising. Of course, a dog's brain registers anticipation of food. The interesting finding was in the comparison with human neuroimaging data. The pattern of caudate activation in dogs was strikingly similar in its location, its magnitude, and its relationship to the predictive stimulus, to the pattern seen in human brains under analogous conditions. The same structure, doing what appeared to be the same kind of work. Burns expanded the research program over the following years, training more dogs and examining more conditions. In subsequent studies, he found that the caudate nucleus was activated not only by food reward signals but by the scent of familiar humans, and that for many of the dogs in the study, the scent of a familiar human produced a stronger caudate response than the scent of food. The brain of the dog, in other words, was registering the anticipated presence of a familiar human as a reward at least equivalent to, and in some cases stronger than, the anticipated presence of something to eat. This finding has been described, with appropriate scientific caution, as evidence that dogs may genuinely value human social contact, not merely as a means to food and resources, but as a positive experience in itself. Burns himself has been careful to note that the presence of activity in a brain region associated with positive expectation in humans does not constitute proof of conscious subjective experience in dogs. The gap between neural correlates and phenomenal consciousness is one of the deepest unsolved problems in all of neuroscience, and it does not become simpler when the brain in question belongs to a different species. But the data is consistent with the hypothesis that dogs experience positive emotional states in the presence of familiar humans, and that these states are neurologically real rather than merely behavioral performances. Now let us move from the scanner to the street, or more precisely, to the research programs that have examined how dogs understand the social world they inhabit, what they know about human minds, what they can infer about human intentions, and where the limits of their social cognition actually lie. The researcher whose name is most closely associated with this field is Brian Hare, currently a professor at Duke University and the founder of the Duke Canine Cognition Center, whose work over the past 2 decades has fundamentally reshaped the scientific understanding of what makes dogs cognitively distinctive. Hare's foundational finding, published initially in the journal Science in 2002 and subsequently replicated and extended by research groups around the world, concerned a deceptively simple task. A piece of food is hidden under one of 2 containers. A human experimenter looks at the container hiding the food, or points at it, or taps it. The question is, can the animal use that communicative gesture to find the food? Human infants can do this from the age of roughly 9 to 14 months before they have developed language. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives sharing approximately 98.7% of our DNA, cannot do it reliably, even after extensive training. They do not appear to understand that the gesture is communicative, that the human pointing is trying to tell them something about the location of the food. They look at the finger, not at what it points toward. Dogs can do it. Not just domestic dogs, even dogs with minimal human socialization can use pointing gestures to locate hidden food significantly above chance levels. And the key is that they seem to understand the gesture as communicative, as an attempt by the human to share information, rather than as a physical indicator to be followed mechanically. Hare's interpretation of this finding is that dogs have evolved, through the process of domestication, a specific cognitive adaptation for reading human communicative intent. Not general intelligence wolves, which score higher than dogs on many tests of physical problem-solving, cannot reliably use human-pointing gestures. Not simply learning, the ability is present in dogs with minimal training. Something more specific than either of those. A sensitivity to human social cues that appears to have been selected for directly during domestication, as an adaptation to the specific challenge of living and working alongside a species whose behaviour is organised by communicative intention in ways that the dog's wolf ancestors had no evolutionary preparation for. This is, when you consider what it means, a profound finding. The dog did not simply become less afraid of humans during domestication. It became, at a deep cognitive level, better at understanding them. Better, in specific and measurable ways, than our nearest evolutionary relatives. The domestication process did not merely tame the wolf. It, in a very real sense, rewired it, building into the domestic dog a suite of social cognitive abilities that track human communicative behaviour with a precision that no other non-human species has matched. But let us also be honest about where the science draws limits, because one of the responsibilities of careful thinking about dog cognition is the willingness to correct popular misunderstandings even when, especially when, those misunderstandings are flattering to our sense of the relationship. The most common of these misunderstandings concerns what is popularly described as guilt. Every dog owner has seen it. The dog that has done something wrong, chewed a shoe, overturned the rubbish bin, made an unauthorized raid on the kitchen counter, and who, when confronted, displays a recognizable cluster of behaviors. Lowered head, flattened ears, tucked tail. Averted gaze, possibly a slow retreat toward the nearest exit. This behavioral display is almost universally interpreted by dog owners as guilt, as evidence that the dog knows it has done something wrong and is experiencing something analogous to the moral discomfort that humans feel in equivalent situations. The research does not support this interpretation. A study published in 2009 by Alexandra Horowitz of Barnard College examined this question with considerable methodological elegance. Horowitz designed a protocol in which owners were told, randomly and regardless of what had actually happened, either that their dog had eaten a forbidden treat while they were absent, or that it had not. Owners then greeted their dogs, who had or had not actually eaten the treat, under the belief established by the experimenter's instruction. The result was unambiguous. The display of what owners described as guilty behaviour was predicted not by whether the dog had actually done anything wrong, but by whether the owner believed it had and greeted the dog accordingly. Dogs who had eaten the treat but whose owners were told they had not showed minimal guilty behaviour. Dogs who had done nothing wrong but whose owners were told they had showed the full repertoire of submissive appeasement responses that owners interpret as guilt. The dogs were not responding to their own internal moral assessment of their behaviour. They were reading the human's emotional state and responding with the appeasement behaviours that, across 15,000 years of domestication, have been selected for as an effective way to de-escalate a human who is displaying displeasure. This is not a failure of dog cognition. It is in fact an illustration of how sophisticated that cognition is. The dog is reading you so accurately that it can detect and respond to your emotional state before you have said or done anything beyond entering the room with a particular quality of tension in your posture. The behaviour that looks like guilt is actually something considerably more interesting. A real-time social assessment and response strategy, operating at a level of sensitivity that most humans never consciously appreciate. Then there is the question of olfactory consciousness, the inner experience of a dog navigating a world that is, for it, organised primarily by smell rather than by sight. The Alexandra Horowitz's subsequent work, particularly her 2016 book Being a Dog, attempts to give the reader something genuinely difficult to achieve, an imaginative reconstruction of what it is like to experience the world through a nose of the dog's capability. The exercise is humbling in the specific way that genuine encounters with radically different forms of intelligence always are. A dog walking along a street is not experiencing the same street that its human companion experiences. The human sees the street, the buildings, the other people, the visual landscape. The dog smells it. Not in the impoverished way that the word smell implies when a human uses it, the detection of strong odours, the occasional pleasant or unpleasant sensation, but in the way that the word see implies when a human uses it, a rich, a detailed, temporally layered, informationally dense experience of the environment that carries vastly more information about what is present, what has been present, and in what condition than the human's visual experience of the same space. The dog moving through the park is reading a document that the human cannot access. It knows which dogs passed through this morning and approximately when and in what physiological state. It knows there is a female dog in the vicinity who is in a particular stage of her reproductive cycle. It knows that a human who passed this way an hour ago was, based on the stress hormones present in their sweat, experiencing significant anxiety. It knows things about the recent history of this space that no human observer, equipped with no instrument currently available to science, could determine. This is not a metaphor. This is the literal informational content available to the dog's olfactory system, as it processes the chemical environment of an ordinary urban park. And what does the dog do with all of this information? What is the subjective experience, if there is one, and the question of whether there is one remains genuinely and perhaps permanently open, of inhabiting a world so rich in olfactory data? Here we reach the boundary of what science can currently tell us, and we must be honest about where that boundary lies. The question of whether dogs have conscious subjective experience, whether there is something it is like to be a dog, in the philosophical sense that the question implies, is not resolved. It may not be resolvable with the tools currently available to neuroscience and cognitive science. The hard problem of consciousness, which is difficult enough when applied to humans whose subjective reports we can access directly, becomes orders of magnitude harder when applied to an animal that cannot tell us what it experiences. What we can say, with confidence grounded in the research, is this. Dogs have complex emotional states that are neurologically real. Their brains contain the same subcortical structures, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the limbic system, that generate emotional responses in humans, and these structures respond to emotionally relevant stimuli in ways that are consistent with genuine emotional processing rather than mere behavioral reflex. Dogs experience fear, pleasure, frustration, and something that functions like affection, in the sense that the physiological markers associated with those states in humans are present in dogs under analogous conditions. Whether these functional states involve subjective experience, whether the dog feels its fear in the way that we feel ours, is the open question. And there is one final finding from the recent literature that deserves to end this chapter, because it is, among all the remarkable things that canine cognition research has produced, perhaps the most quietly astonishing. Dogs look left first. When a dog encounters a human face and attempts to read its emotional expression, its eyes move first to the left side of the face, which is to say, the right side from the perspective of the person being looked at. This leftward gaze bias is significant because the right side of a human face is controlled by the left hemisphere of the brain, and the left hemisphere of the brain is, in humans, the hemisphere most involved in emotional expression. The right side of a human face is, for this reason, typically more emotionally expressive than the left. Dogs appear to have learned, through 15,000 years of living with and depending on humans, to look first at the part of the human face that is most likely to tell them what they need to know. They have developed a perceptual bias, specific to human faces, that tracks the structure of human emotional expression with a precision that most humans are completely unaware of. No other animal has been shown to exhibit this bias toward human faces, not chimpanzees, not wolves, not any of the other species that share our environments and our lives, only dogs, only the animal that crossed the threshold of the firelight 15,000 years ago and stayed and kept watching and kept learning until watching and learning and reading the human face became part of what it means to be the animal that it is. We have been studying dogs for as long as we have kept them, and we are only now, with the tools of modern neuroscience and cognitive science and behavioral ecology, beginning to understand the depth and the specificity and the genuine biological reality of what the relationship has built in them. They know us. In some ways, it appears, they know us better than we know ourselves, and perhaps that particular irreplaceable 15,000-year-old form of being known is what we have been trying to tell ourselves in every burial and every painting and every poem and every breed standard and every late night when we reach down in the dark and feel a warm body breathing steadily beside us. That the knowing goes in both directions, that it always has. There is a dog sleeping somewhere near you right now, perhaps in the same room, perhaps down the hall, breathing in that slow, unhurried rhythm that belongs only to deep animal sleep, the kind of sleep that has no anxiety in it, no unfinished thoughts, no inventory of tomorrow's concerns. Perhaps you can hear it. Perhaps you cannot, but you know it is there, the way you always know when a familiar presence occupies the same darkness, the same quiet, the same patch of the night. Or perhaps there is no dog near you tonight. Perhaps you are listening from a city apartment or a room in a country where dogs live differently than they do in the places we have spent most of this journey imagining. Perhaps the dog in this final image is not yours, but borrowed, held in the mind the way a memory is held, or the way a story holds the thing it is about long after the last word has been spoken. Either way, the dog is there. It is always there, in this story. That is what 15,000 years means, when you compress it into a single image and hold it still long enough to look at it. It means that the dog is so thoroughly woven into the fabric of human life that to imagine the human story without it is not merely difficult. It is, in some fundamental sense, impossible. Take the dog out of the history we have travelled through tonight and something collapses, not just the practical architecture of the hunting camp and the medieval estate and the Victorian household, but something more essential than any of those things, something in the quality of what it has meant, across all of those centuries and all of those cultures, to be a human being living in a world that is worth living in. We have come a long way tonight. We began in a darkness before history, on a frozen Pleistocene steppe, with a fire and a shadow at the edge of the light. We have walked through the cave at Goyet and stood at the grave at Bon Oberkassel with its careful arrangement of ochre and bone. We have moved through the river valleys of Mesopotamia and the necropolis at Saqqara and the hunting forests of Norman England. We have watched a Victorian dog show through gaslit windows and followed Sergeant Stubby through the mud of the Western Front, and sat quietly with a small scared dog in a Moscow laboratory in the autumn of 1957. We have looked at what the science says as clearly and as honestly as it can say it, that the bond is neurologically real, that the oxytocin moves in both directions, that the dog looks left first, reading the human face with a precision built by 15,000 years of paying attention to us, that the guilt is not guilt but something more interesting, that the nose knows things about the world that we will never fully understand from the inside, that the question of what it is like to be a dog, of whether there is a there, a subjective warmth behind the eyes that are watching you right now from across the room, remains beautifully and perhaps permanently open. What this journey has given us, if we have followed it with the right quality of attention, is not a set of answers. It is a deepened sense of the question, of what it means that this particular relationship, of all the relationships our species has formed with the other creatures of this planet, is the one that endured, that crossed every threshold with us, that slept beside every fire we built and followed every migration route we walked and found us, again and again, in whatever new world we had made and stayed. The dog did not have to stay. That is the thing. The wolf at the edge of the firelight could have turned back into the dark. Some of them did. Most of them did. But the ones that did not, the ones that took one more step toward the warmth, and then another, and then found themselves close enough to be touched, those animals began something that neither they nor the humans who first reached out toward them could have understood or intended or foreseen. They began us. Not us as a biological species, we were already that. But us as the kind of beings who keep faith with other kinds of beings, who make room, even in conditions of scarcity and cold and genuine danger, for a creature that is not their own kind, who name their animals, and bury them, and grieve them, and write poems about them 3,000 years after the fact, and build institutions to protect them, and lie awake sometimes in the dark just to hear them breathe. The dog taught us something about ourselves that we would not otherwise have known, that we were capable of it. Before we go, and I hope you're already somewhere close to the edge of sleep, somewhere comfortable and warm, with the weight of 15,000 years settled gently over you like something familiar, I want to ask you one more time to leave a trace of yourself in this space. Leave a comment. Tell us where in the world you are right now. Tell us what time it is. Tell us whether there is a dog somewhere near you in the dark. Because the knowing of where we all are scattered across the planet In all our different darknesses and different time zones and different languages gathered around the same story, feels like exactly the right note to end on. If this journey gave you something tonight, if it slowed something down in you, or opened something up, or simply kept you company through the quiet hours, please consider leaving a like and subscribing so that more people can find their way here, so that more people can lie down in the dark and let 15,000 years of history settle over them like a warm weight. This channel is built for exactly this, for the long, slow, careful kind of knowing, for the stories that deserve more time than we usually give them. We will be here when you come back. Good night. Wherever you are, however far the fire reaches, the dog is there, it has always been there, and it is not going anywhere.